The complete story of Horus Lupercal, the Warmaster's rise, fall, and the heresy. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. Yet even in a universe defined by endless conflict, few names carry the weight of infamy quite like Horus Lupercal. The first among the Primarchs to be found, the most beloved son of the Emperor, the architect of humanity's greatest triumph, and, ultimately, the betrayer who nearly destroyed everything his father had built. His story is not simply one of personal ambition or corruption. It is the foundational tragedy upon which the entire modern Imperium was forged, a tale of brotherhood shattered, of trust betrayed, and of the horrifying price paid when gods walk among men and lose their way. To understand the Imperium of man in the 41st millennium, with its endless paranoia, its brutal authoritarianism, its worship of a corpse emperor enthroned in gold, you must first understand what came before. You must understand the Great Crusade, that shining era when humanity reached for the stars with hope instead of desperation, when the Legiones Astartes were heroes and not monsters, when the emperor walked among his sons as a father, not as a distant deity. And to understand the Great Crusade, you must understand Horus, for he embodied everything it represented. Brilliant, charismatic, capable of inspiring absolute loyalty in those who served under him, yet also prideful, insecure, and susceptible to manipulation by forces he could not comprehend. The Horus Heresy stands as the single most catastrophic civil war in human history. A galaxy-spanning conflict, shattered worlds, and left scars that 10,000 years could not heal. It transformed the Imperium from a secular, rationalist empire into a theocratic nightmare. It entombed the Emperor upon the Golden Throne, neither truly alive nor truly dead. It scattered the Primarchs, some slain, others lost, and still others twisted into daemon princes serving the very powers they once fought against. The ripples of those 7 terrible years continue to define every aspect of the Imperium, from the black rage that haunts the Blood Angels to the eternal war waged by the Black Legion, from the suspicion with which all Space Marines are viewed to the very nature of the Imperial faith itself. This is not a story with easy villains or simple heroes. Horus was not born evil, nor did he wake one morning and decide to betray everything he held dear. His fall was orchestrated across decades by the word-bearers and the ruinous powers, exploiting every flaw in his character, every moment of doubt, every seed of resentment. The Emperor, for all his power and foresight, failed to see the trap closing around his most favored son until it was far too late. The other Primarchs, each with their own strengths and fatal weaknesses, made choices that seemed right at the time, but led inexorably toward catastrophe. Even the Chaos Gods themselves, though undeniably malevolent, were not simply arbitrary forces of destruction, but rather aspects of emotion and existence itself, twisted by millennia of war and suffering into something monstrous. What makes Horus's story so compelling, so endlessly fascinating to scholars and remembrancers alike, is precisely this complexity. He was genuinely great. His military genius was unmatched among his brothers. His diplomatic skills brought countless worlds into compliance without a shot fired. His charisma united disparate factions under a common banner. The Emperor's decision to name him Warmaster was not favoritism or sentimentality. It was recognition of genuine superiority. Horus earned his position through 2 centuries of exemplary service. Yet all these gifts, all this greatness, only made his fall more terrible, his betrayal more devastating, his corruption more complete. The scope of his treachery staggers comprehension. Horus did not simply rebel. He corrupted half his brother Primarchs to his cause. He manipulated events to ensure loyalist legions were scattered far from Terra when the hammer finally fell. He orchestrated the drop site massacre at Isstvan, the single bloodiest betrayal in Imperial history, where 3 entire loyalist legions were nearly annihilated in a single afternoon. He brought the full might of 8 traitor legions, supplemented by demonic hordes and traitor army regiments, to the very gates of the Imperial Palace. He came within a hair's breadth of victory. Had Guilliman's fleet arrived mere hours later, had the Emperor hesitated a moment longer before confronting his son, the entire galaxy would have been plunged into eternal darkness. The scattered sun, Chthoniya, and the making of a Primarch. Before he was Warmaster, before he was traitor, before he was anything at all, Horus Lupercal began as we all began, as a child. Yet even that simple statement requires elaboration, for the Primarchs were never truly children in any conventional sense. Created in the gene laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains on Terra, forged from the Emperor's own genetic template, combined with powers drawn from sources that remain debated even now, the 20 Primarchs represented the apex of genetic engineering, the ultimate fusion of science and something beyond science. Each was designed to embody specific aspects of the Emperor himself, to serve as generals in the coming reconquest of the galaxy, to lead their Space Marine legions in the Great Crusade that would reunite scattered humanity under one banner. But the Chaos Gods had other plans. Through means that even the Emperor could not fully counter, the nascent Primarchs were torn from their gestation pods and scattered through the warp to distant worlds across the galaxy. This act of cosmic kidnapping served multiple purposes for the ruinous powers. It deprived the Emperor of his greatest weapons at a critical moment. It exposed the infant Primarchs to influences beyond his control. And perhaps most cunningly, it planted seeds that would not bear fruit for 2 centuries, whispers in the darkness of young minds that would one day blossom into full corruption. The capsule containing the being who would become Horus Lupercal fell to a world called Chthoniya, a mining planet that lay only a few light years from Terra itself. This proximity proved crucial. Had his pod fallen to some distant sector, Horus might have spent decades maturing before his father found him, as happened with so many of his brothers. Instead, the Emperor discovered Horus relatively quickly, making him the first Primarch to be reunited with his father. This early reunion shaped everything that followed, for Horus alone among his brothers enjoyed decades at the Emperor's side while his siblings remained lost. He became not merely a son, but a confidant, not merely a general, but the Emperor's right hand. This special relationship would later make his betrayal all the more devastating. But first, there were the early years on Chthoniya, and those years left their mark. Chthoniya was no paradise world, no gleaming jewel of civilization. It had been settled in the very earliest days of humanity's expansion into the stars, its rich natural resources ruthlessly exploited until they were nearly exhausted. By the time Horus arrived,
Chthonia had decayed into a post-industrial nightmare, its surface dominated by crumbling hive cities, its depths honeycombed with abandoned mines, its population consisting of anarchic gangs that waged endless warfare in the darkness beneath the world's surface. Some accounts describe Chthonia as comparable to Nostromo, home world of the Night Lords, a planet so steeped in violence and cruelty that death was considered preferable to capture. The infant Primarch was discovered by a gang overlord named Kagejin, who gave the strange child the no-name of Nergi. In many cultures, such names were given to ward off evil spirits, essentially meaning no name or nameless one. For a time, the young Primarch lived as any Chthonian youth might, engaging in the brutal gang warfare that characterized life beneath the planet's surface. What makes this period remarkable is that unlike most of his brothers who quickly manifested their superhuman abilities, the young Nergi seemed to develop at a relatively normal pace initially. He learned the harsh lessons of gang warfare as a mortal child might, understanding violence and survival not from some innate genetic memory, but through lived experience. This changed dramatically when Nergi stumbled upon his original landing pod, which was being excavated by adepts of the Mechanicum. In a confrontation that would prove prophetic, the young Primarch fought the tech priests, killing one and claiming his weapon before fleeing back to Kagejin. The gang leader scolded Nergi for his recklessness, warning that the Mechanicum would pursue them. Kagejin refused to grant Nergi his kill name over this incident, much to the young warrior's frustration. In Chthonian culture, earning one's kill name was a rite of passage, a recognition of having taken a life significant to define oneself.
Events unfolded exactly as Kagejin predicted. Mechanicum forces arrived at their tribal hold, digging through from the surface. As the chamber collapsed around them and most of the gang faced death, Kagejin gave Nergi one final gift. He instructed the young Primarch to slay him, to earn his kill name through this ultimate act. When Nergi performed this terrible deed, killing the only father figure he had known, something awakened within him. Buried memories flooded back, visions of the galaxy, understanding of technology, awareness of what he truly was. Even his body began to swell, his true nature finally manifesting. When the tech priests finally broke through into the chamber, they found not a gang youth, but a Primarch standing before them. Nergi proclaimed himself Horus, taking the name that would echo through history. The subsequent journey to Terra marked the true beginning of Horus's story. According to his own accounts, he was brought from Chthonia to Terra alongside several elderly comrades from the gang world, arriving to much fanfare. He knelt before the Emperor and swore oaths of service, pledging to serve dutifully in the coming reconquest of the galaxy. Some sources dispute this narrative, suggesting instead that Horus returned to Terra itself through different means, but the core truth remains undeniable. Horus was found. He was reunited with his father, and the bond that formed between them would define both their fates. What's particularly noteworthy about Horus's time on Chthonia is how it shaped his character and methods. Unlike some Primarchs who grew up in cultures of honor and nobility, or others raised by enlightened rulers who taught them philosophy and governance, Horus learned his earliest lessons in the brutal underworld of a decaying industrial planet. He understood gang warfare, the importance of loyalty among warriors, the value of speaking in ways that common soldiers could relate to.
Later in his career, when Horus spoke Chthonic, he did so with the particular hard palatal edge and rough vowels of a Western Hemispheric ganger, the commonest and roughest of Chthonia's pharaoh castes. Some of his battle brothers found this amusing, assuming he spoke this way simply because that's how he'd learned the language. But others suspected that Horus never did anything by accident, that his rough Chthonic accent was a deliberate affectation designed to make him seem as honest and lowborn as any of his warriors, to bridge the gap between Primarch and Space Marine through shared cultural markers. This ability to connect with his warriors on a personal level, to make each battle brother feel valued and understood, would prove one of Horus's greatest strengths. It also proved one of his most dangerous qualities when he fell, for the loyalty he inspired was absolute. When Horus turned traitor, he did not do so alone. Entire legions followed him into damnation, not because they believed in chaos, but because they believed in him. That kind of devotion, forged in the fires of 2 centuries of campaigning, could not be easily broken. It persisted even as Horus became something monstrous, even as the Warmaster they had loved transformed into a vessel for the ruinous powers. The Chthonian culture that Horus carried with him also manifested in other ways throughout his legion. The Lunawolves and later the Sons of Horus recruited heavily from Chthonia's gang fighters, bringing that world's savage pragmatism into the 16th Legion's character. They were brutal but not unnecessarily cruel, efficient but not cold, capable of savage violence but also of mercy when it served their purposes. They embodied their Primarch's philosophy, victory through whatever means necessary, but always with an eye toward the larger strategic picture. This approach made them extraordinarily effective during the Great Crusade. It also made them exceptionally dangerous during the Heresy, for they understood warfare not as some ritualized contest of honor, but as the ruthless business of killing and surviving.
First among brothers, the Emperor's chosen son. For 30 standard years, Horus Lupercal was the only Primarch who had been found. 3 decades during which he served at his father's side, learning, fighting, growing into the role that would eventually see him named Warmaster. This period of unique favor proved both blessing and curse. On one hand, it gave Horus unparalleled insight into the Emperor's methods, strategies, and vision for humanity. He understood the Imperium in ways his brothers never quite could, having been present from its earliest days. On the other hand, it created an expectation, a sense that he was somehow more special, more favored, more essential than any who came after. When other Primarchs were eventually found and began to eclipse his achievements in their specialized areas, when the Emperor's attention necessarily became more divided, Horus experienced these shifts as personal rejections rather than natural consequences of a growing family of demigods. The bond between Emperor and first found son deepened through shared combat. At the Siege of Relis, when a human settlement unwilling to accept the imperial truth mounted fierce resistance, the defending army used secret tunnels to infiltrate behind imperial lines. Hundreds of shock troops swarmed the command encampment, catching the Emperor and Horus unprepared and unarmored. They fought back to back, father and son against overwhelming odds, until a plasma blast stunned the young Primarch and sent him staggering. The Emperor stood over his fallen son and refused to give ground until reinforcements arrived to drive the attackers back. Horus never forgot that moment,
when the master of mankind could have withdrawn to safety, but chose instead to protect him at great personal risk. Later, on the world of Goro, within the Telon Reach, Horus repaid this debt. An Orc empire that rivaled the later threat centered on Ulanor had established itself there, and the Emperor decreed that Goro must be destroyed. During the brutal fighting, a frenzied Orc managed to get its hands around the Emperor's throat, attempting to choke the life from the master of mankind. Horus hacked the creature's arm off, saving his father's life. These shared moments of mortal danger, these instances where they saved each other from death, created bonds that went beyond simple filial duty or military hierarchy. They were battle brothers in the truest sense, warriors who had bled together and trusted each other absolutely. When the Emperor gave Horus command of the 16th Legion, the Luna Wolves, it marked formal recognition of what had become increasingly clear. This Primarch was special. The Luna Wolves had already established themselves as one of the Imperium's most effective fighting forces, recruited from Terra's hunter clans and harsh slums, places that bred ruthless and independent spirits. The arrival of their Gene Father only amplified these qualities. Horus did not simply command the Legion. He transformed it into an extension of his own tactical genius, creating a force capable of responding flexibly to any threat, of finding enemy weaknesses and exploiting them ruthlessly, of achieving victory through cunning as much as through raw power. The Luna Wolves' doctrine reflected Horus's own approach to warfare. They favored small, highly flexible formations over rigid order of battle. They emphasized precision strikes against enemy leadership structures, understanding that an army without commanders was merely an armed mob. They deployed rapidly, struck hard, and withdrew before the enemy could mount an effective response. Their companies operated with considerable autonomy, trusted to make tactical decisions without requiring constant oversight. This decentralized command structure made them extraordinarily effective across diverse combat environments, but it also meant that the Luna Wolves developed a culture of independent action that would later prove dangerous when Horus turned to chaos.
As other Primarchs were found and took command of their respective legions, Horus stood out not merely for his tactical brilliance, but for his diplomatic skills. He possessed an uncanny ability to understand what motivated people, to speak to their hopes and fears, to inspire loyalty through genuine connection rather than mere charisma. Where some of his brothers ruled through fear and others through rigid honor codes, Horus led through understanding. He remembered names. He listened to concerns. He celebrated victories with his warriors and shared in their grief when brothers fell. This made him beloved, not merely by his own legion, but across the entire crusade. From common army troopers who might glimpse him only once, to brother Primarchs who fought alongside him in the greatest campaigns. The campaigns Horus led during these early years of the Great Crusade became legendary. During the war in the Shedium Drifts against the marauding Eldery of Craftworld Moor, Horus commanded a vast imperial force comprising no less than 4 Titan legions. The apocalyptic battle that raged upon the planet's surface saw a full demi-legio of the Legio Ataris encircled and all but destroyed. Horus had cruelly used them, without their foreknowledge or consent, as a ruse to divert enemy strength away from their craft world, while his legion undertook a surprise assault against it. The War of Shedium Drifts was a great victory for Horus, and all those who fought in the campaign gained glory because of it. But it came at the expense of the Legio Ataris, an injury the Firebrands would neither forget nor forgive.
This incident revealed something important about Horus's character. He was willing to sacrifice allies without their knowledge if it served the larger strategic objective. This calculated ruthlessness, while militarily effective, suggested a moral flexibility that would prove extremely dangerous once turned toward treacherous ends. When the emperor departed to find and meet with newly rediscovered Primarchs, Horus was often left in temporary command of the Legiones Astartes. This helped prepare him for his eventual role as Warmaster, giving him experience in coordinating multiple legions, in balancing different Primarch strengths and egos, and in making decisions that affected entire segmentums of space. He commanded pioneer companies of legions whose Primarchs had not yet been found, including elements of the V-Legion that would eventually become the White Scars. He led combined arms operations that integrated Space Marine legions with Imperial Army regiments, Titan legions, and naval assets. He demonstrated again and again that he understood not merely tactics, but grand strategy. That he could see how individual battles fit into larger campaigns, how campaigns served theater-level objectives, how theater victories advanced the Imperium's ultimate goal of reuniting all humanity under one government. But for all his brilliance, for all his victories, for all the genuine affection in which he was held, Horus was not without flaws. He possessed his father's hunger for achievement, but lacked the emperor's patience. He excelled at war, but chafed at the administrative duties of governance. He inspired fierce loyalty, but struggled with criticism, even when warranted. He understood human psychology well enough to manipulate it, but sometimes failed to perceive when he himself was being manipulated. These weaknesses remained relatively harmless during the early Crusade, overshadowed by his many strengths. But they were there, waiting. The ruinous powers had planted their seeds during his infancy, and those seeds had taken root in precisely these character flaws, growing slowly, waiting for the moment when they could bloom into full corruption. His relationship with his brother Primarchs proved complex. With Sanguinius, he shared perhaps his deepest friendship, recognizing in the Angel of Baal a kindred spirit who combined martial prowess with genuine nobility of character. With Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children, he enjoyed a bond based on mutual respect and admiration, each seeing in the other a reflection of their own drive toward perfection. With Ferrus Manos of the Iron Hands, he shared camaraderie forged in the fires of the Goro campaign and countless subsequent battles. Yet with others, relationships proved more fraught. Angron's barely controlled rage made him unpredictable and difficult to work with. Praetorba's resentment at being assigned thankless garrison duties created friction. Conrad Kurz's brutal methods and apocalyptic visions troubled Horus, even as he recognized the Night Lord's effectiveness. When Leman Russ of the Space Wolves was found, some sources suggest tension developed between the two. Russ and Lion L. Johnson both eventually accepted the Emperor's decision to name Horus Warmaster, but accounts hint at embittered feelings beneath the surface. Guliaman of the Ultramarines, Khan of the White Scars, and Ferrus Manos supported the decision primarily out of duty rather than enthusiastic endorsement. These undercurrents of jealousy and resentment would later prove exploitable when Horus fell, for several Primarchs who turned traitor did so partly because they felt Horus understood them better than their father did, that the Warmaster valued them in ways the Emperor apparently did not.
The Warmaster rises, Ulanor, and the height of glory. Though the Luna Wolves had won many victories in their years of ceaseless conflict, one would eclipse all others and see them reborn once again. The greatest of the nascent Imperium's victories during the high point of the Great Crusade came in the form of the defeat of the largest Orc empire ever encountered. The Ulanor Crusade was a vast imperial assault on the Orc empire of the overlord Erlak Uruk. The capital world of this green-skinned stellar empire, and the site of the final assault by the Space Marine legions, lay in the central Ulanor system of the galaxy's Ulanor sector. The scale of this threat cannot be overstated. The Orcs had established dominion over dozens of worlds, fielding armies of such magnitude that they threatened to overwhelm Imperial forces through sheer numbers alone. The Emperor himself took personal command of the Ulanor Crusade, understanding that this represented not merely another compliance action, but a statement about humanity's resurgence. If the Orcs could not be defeated decisively, if their empire could not be utterly destroyed, then doubts would spread about the Imperium's ultimate viability. The assembled forces for Ulanor represented one of the largest concentrations of military might ever gathered under imperial banners. Multiple Space Marine legions participated, including the Luna Wolves, Imperial Fists, White Scars, Blood Angels, and others. Titan legions marched alongside them. Millions of Imperial Army troopers prepared for the ground assault. The Imperial Navy assembled a fleet capable of establishing orbital superiority over even the Orcs' ramshackle but numerous void assets. Horus commanded significant portions of this vast army, coordinating legion actions with his characteristic skill. The Luna Wolves served as the tip of the spear, striking at critical junctures, exploiting weaknesses in Orc defenses, achieving breakthrough after breakthrough that allowed other Imperial forces to exploit the gaps. When the final assault on Ulanor Prime began, Horus led from the front, his presence inspiring warriors across multiple legions to feats of incredible heroism. The Orcs fought with savage fury, for they recognized that defeat here meant the end of their empire. But Imperial coordination and superior firepower eventually prevailed. Erlak Uruk fell. His empire shattered, his worlds brought under Imperial control or rendered uninhabitable through sustained bombardment. In the aftermath of this tremendous victory, the Emperor organized a triumph on Ulanor, a massive celebration that brought together Primarchs, Legion commanders, Imperial Army generals, and representatives from across the growing Imperium. It was during this triumph that the Emperor made an announcement that would change everything. He was naming Horus Warmaster, granting him supreme command over all Imperial military forces. The Emperor's words during that ceremony have been preserved. "My work as a soldier is done, and now passes to you, for I have great tasks to perform in my earthly sanctum. I name you Warmaster, and from this day forth all of my armies and generals shall take orders from you as if the words came from mine own mouth. But words of caution I have for you, for your brother Primarchs are strong of will, of thought, and of action. Do not seek to change them, but use their particular strengths well. You have much work to do, for there are still many worlds to liberate, many peoples to rescue. My trust is with you. Hail, Horus! Hail the Warmaster!" This elevation represented the culmination of everything Horus had worked toward. He had proven himself the greatest of the Primarchs, not through brute strength or psychic might, but through strategic genius, diplomatic skill, and an unmatched ability to inspire those who served under him.
The title of Warmaster placed him second only to the Emperor himself in the Imperium's hierarchy, granting him authority over even his brother Primarchs. It was recognition, vindication, validation of everything he had accomplished during 2 centuries of campaigning. It should have been his final hour, the moment when all his efforts bore ultimate fruit. Yet, even in this moment of triumph, seeds of future tragedy were being sown. The Emperor did not explain what great tasks awaited him on Terra, sharing only that his work as a soldier was done. This created confusion and resentment among many Primarchs. They had fought for 2 centuries to reunite humanity, to bring the scattered worlds of the galaxy under one banner. And now, with victory finally in sight, their father was departing? The Emperor's secretiveness about his Webway project, his refusal to explain that he was attempting to create a safe means of faster-than-light travel that would free humanity from dependence on warp travel and thus break the Chaos God's hold over mankind's destiny, meant that his sons interpreted his departure as abandonment rather than necessity. The Emperor also suggested that the 16th Legion be renamed the Sons of Horus in honor of their Primarch's singular achievements. Horus was initially reluctant to accept this honor, finding it too aggrandizing. But after a conversation with Sanguinius in the wake of the Lunawolves' inability to avoid war with the human Exynos hybrid civilization known as the Interrex, the angel argued that Horus deserved the honor and needed to establish his command more firmly over his brother Primarchs. Sanguinius understood that some of their brothers would resent taking orders from a sibling, that the title of Warmaster alone might not be sufficient to ensure cooperation. Renaming the Legion would serve as a constant reminder of Horus's elevated status, reinforcing through symbolism what law had already established. Thus, the Lunawolves became the Sons of Horus, trading their lupine logo for the glaring Eye of Horus, swapping their white armor for sea green ceramite. The symbolism was powerful, but also problematic. It tied the Legion's identity directly to their Primarch, in ways that went beyond normal gene-son connections. When Horus eventually fell, the Sons of Horus did not remain loyal to the Imperium or to the Emperor. They followed their father into damnation, for they defined themselves not as servants of the Imperium, but as Horus's personal warriors. This intense identification with their Primarch, deliberately cultivated to strengthen Horus's authority, became the mechanism through which an entire legion was corrupted.
The reactions of the other Primarchs to Horus's elevation varied significantly. Rogel Dorn, Sanguinius, and Fulgrim were pleased for their brother, recognizing both his capability and his achievement. Others reacted with varying degrees of disapproval. Angron, Perturable, and Conrad Kurz felt they either deserved the title themselves or simply didn't want to take orders from a brother. Lehman Russ and Lionel Johnson openly accepted the decision but were clearly embittered by it. Rabute Gilliman, Jagatai Khan, and Ferrus Manus supported the decision primarily out of duty rather than enthusiasm. These undercurrents of resentment would later prove exploitable, for when Horus fell to chaos, several of these same Primarchs proved willing to join his rebellion, seeing in the Warmaster's revolt a chance to reshape the Imperium according to their own visions. As the Emperor departed for Terra, leaving Horus in command of the Great Crusade, the Warmaster threw himself into his new responsibilities with characteristic energy. He coordinated dozens of simultaneous campaigns across multiple segmentums.
He mediated disputes between primarchs whose methods or personalities clashed. He made strategic decisions about which threats to prioritize, which regions to secure, which Xenos empires to eliminate first. His genius for organization and coordination shone during this period. Under his leadership, the pace of the crusade actually accelerated, with more worlds being brought into compliance than ever before. But the emperor's absence created a vacuum that Horus, for all his abilities, could not entirely fill. The master of mankind had been more than just supreme military commander. He had been the Imperium's spiritual center, the living embodiment of the imperial truth, the proof that humanity could achieve godhood through reason and will alone. With the emperor gone, questions began to arise. What exactly was he doing on Terra? Why wouldn't he share his plans with his sons? Did he truly trust them, or were they merely tools to be used and discarded once their usefulness ended? These questions, these doubts, found fertile ground in minds that had spent 2 centuries in constant warfare, in souls that were beginning to understand the emptiness that comes when conquest becomes an end rather than a means. It was into this environment of uncertainty and doubt that Erebus of the Word-Bearers inserted himself. The first chaplain began having secretive dealings with the Luna Wolves Legion and with Horus in particular. On the surface, these interactions seemed innocent enough, discussions of philosophy and the Crusade's ultimate purpose, conversations about the role of warriors once the fighting finally ended. But Erebus was not merely a chaplain. He was an agent of chaos, perhaps the first space marine to consciously embrace the ruinous powers, and he had spent decades preparing for this moment. Every word he spoke to Horus was carefully calculated. Every doubt he planted was precisely targeted. Every suggestion he made was designed to exploit the Warmaster's character flaws while avoiding any obvious manipulation that might trigger Horus's considerable political instincts. The stage was set. The greatest military mind humanity had ever produced stood at the height of his power, commanding armies that could conquer the galaxy, beloved by those who served under him, trusted absolutely by his father. And moving in the shadows, working patiently toward goals that would not become clear for years yet, were forces that understood that the brighter the light, the deeper the shadow it casts. Horus Lupercal's fall would not come suddenly. It would unfold gradually, a corruption so subtle that by the time he recognized what was happening, it would already be far too late to turn back.
Seeds of corruption, Davin, and the first steps toward darkness. The world of Davin had been brought into imperial compliance by Horus and the 63rd Expedition Fleet during the early years of the Great Crusade. It was the 8th world conquered by that fleet, designated 63-8, until it earned the right to keep its original name. The indigenous warrior tribes people had briefly attempted to resist imperial takeover, but they were quickly and completely outclassed in military terms. Impressed by their battlefield courage and their willingness to learn and adapt to new ways of life, Horus had been lenient with them, allowing their warrior culture to remain largely intact after they surrendered. To imperial forces, it seemed a minor mercy, the kind of magnanimous gesture the Warmaster made countless times throughout his campaigns. What Horus did not know, what perhaps could not have been known given the Imperium's systematic rejection of any knowledge about the warp and its denizens, was that the humans of Davin had evolved a warrior culture over the millennia that was intimately connected to the dark gods of chaos.
They formed themselves into lodges that venerated predatory beasts, practicing rituals that were, in truth, worship of the ruinous powers. When the Luna Wolves moved on after securing compliance, the Word-Bearers remained behind to bring the imperial truth to the Davanites. But as the Word-Bearers taught, they also learned, and the 17th Legion adopted the fraternal ideas behind the lodges. As the Great Crusade continued, the Word-Bearers spread these lodges to other legions, presenting them as simple warrior fraternities, places where Space Marines could gather outside the formal hierarchy to share concerns, build bonds of brotherhood, and find community. On the surface, the lodges seemed harmless, even beneficial. They cut across company and chapter lines, allowing warriors from different units to know one another personally. They provided venues for airing grievances that might seem inappropriate in formal settings. They created networks of personal loyalty that supplemented official chains of command. But as Lorgar and his sons became corrupted by the ruinous powers, so too did the lodges, becoming mechanisms for spreading seeds of treachery throughout multiple legions. Within the Sons of Horus, the lodge found particularly fertile ground. Warriors who had spent their entire existence in constant warfare, who had conquered hundreds of worlds without clear understanding of what would come after victory, found comfort in the lodge's fellowship. They discussed their concerns about the Emperor's departure, their questions about what purpose warriors would serve in a galaxy at peace, their doubts about whether the imperial truth truly offered meaning sufficient to sustain them. These were not unreasonable concerns. They were genuine anxieties felt by warriors who had known nothing but war and wondered what their place would be when the fighting finally ended. But Erebus and his fellow word-bearers carefully shaped these discussions, always pushing conversations in directions that served Chaos's purposes. They encouraged resentment toward the Emperor for his secrecy and apparent abandonment. They planted doubts about whether the imperial truth was truly the whole truth or merely one perspective among many. They suggested that the Primarchs, including Horus, deserved more recognition and autonomy than they received. Most insidiously, they introduced concepts from forbidden religions and philosophical systems, always framed as mere intellectual exercises rather than actual worship, gradually acclimating Space Marines to ideas that would have been instantly rejected if presented directly. The trap was being prepared, but it required the perfect moment to spring. That moment came when the 63rd Expedition received word that Davin's moon had fallen into rebellion. Reports indicated that the planet's former governor, Yugon Temba, had been corrupted by some Xenos influence and now led an army of corrupted humans against Imperial forces. The situation seemed straightforward. A compliance world had fallen to Xenos corruption and needed to be reconquered. For Horus, it represented a personal affront. He had been merciful to Davin, had allowed their culture to persist, and this was how they repaid that mercy? The insult demanded personal response. What Horus did not know, what perhaps could not have been known given the Imperium's systematic rejection of any knowledge about the warp and its denizens, was that the entire situation had been orchestrated by Erebus. The first chaplain had spent years corrupting Temba through the lodges, transforming the loyal Imperial governor into a vessel for chaos. The Xenos influence was actually demonic possession, facilitated by a chaos artifact, a grotesque sword called the Kinnebrak Anatheme that had been stolen from the Interrex during that disastrous first contact. Erebus had planted the weapon where Temba would find it, knowing that the governor's corruption would inevitably draw Horus to Davin's moon. Every element of the trap had been prepared with meticulous care, accounting for Horus's personality, his sense of honor, his pride, and his tactical preferences. The Warmaster led a ground assault personally, taking with him elements of his legion, including his most trusted advisors. They descended to the swampy, disease-ridden moon where Temba had established his base within the ruins of an ancient fortress. The environment itself seemed hostile, the air thick with spores and toxins, the ground treacherous with hidden pools and unstable terrain. But the Sons of Horus were veterans of countless campaigns across every imaginable environment. They pushed forward, eliminating corrupted soldiers, advancing inexorably toward Temba's stronghold.
When Horus finally confronted his former governor, he found a creature barely recognizable as human. Temba had swollen to grotesque proportions, his body twisted by Nurgle's gifts, his mind entirely consumed by demonic influence. Yet he retained enough awareness to recognize Horus, to mock the Warmaster for his naivety, to reveal that everything happening here served purposes far beyond Horus's comprehension. In the battle that followed, Horus slew Temba, but not before the anatheme bit deep into the Primarch's flesh. It was a small wound, barely noticeable amid the carnage of battle, easily overlooked by warriors focused on securing victory. But the anatheme was no ordinary weapon. It had been specifically designed to kill Primarchs, forged with demonic arts to bypass even a gene-forged son's legendary resilience. The poison it carried was not merely physical, but spiritual, attacking Horus on levels that conventional medicine could not address. As the Sons of Horus withdrew from the moon, celebrating their victory over the corrupted forces, their Primarch began to fail. The wound refused to heal. Fever set in. Horus, who had fought for 2 centuries without serious injury, who had stood against Orc war bosses and Eldari farseers without taking significant harm, found himself brought low by what should have been a trivial cut. The Legion's apothecaries tried everything they knew. They administered antitoxins, performed gene therapy, attempted surgical interventions. Nothing worked. Horus's condition continued to deteriorate, his enhanced physiology somehow unable to fight off the infection. As hours turned to days and the Warmaster's life hung by increasingly thin threads, desperation set in among his sons. They had conquered worlds, defeated enemies that would have destroyed lesser forces, survived horrors that broke mortal minds. But they were watching their father die from a wound they couldn't treat, and their helplessness bred panic. It was in this moment of crisis that Erebus made his move. The first chaplain approached the Sons of Horus leadership with a suggestion. The Davanites had healing traditions, spiritual practices that went beyond conventional medicine. Perhaps their methods could save the Warmaster where Imperial science had failed. The Lodge members among the Sons of Horus immediately supported this idea, arguing that any chance to save their father, no matter how slim, had to be pursued. Others objected, recognizing that the Davanites' practices contradicted the Imperial Truth's rational materialist worldview. But as Horus's condition continued worsening, objections were overruled by desperation.
The ritual took place in a Davanite temple, a structure whose architecture seemed to shift and flow when viewed peripherally, whose walls were covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. They laid Horus upon an altar, while Davanite priests chanted in languages that predated human settlement of their world. Erebus directed the ceremony, claiming to have studied their healing arts during the Word-Bearer's time on Davin. What he actually performed was a dark ritual designed to open Horus's soul to the ruinous powers, using the anatheme's poison as a doorway through which chaos could reach the Warmaster's spirit. While Horus's body lay comatose in the temple, his consciousness traveled through the warp. What he experienced during this journey would determine the fate of the galaxy. The Chaos Gods, acting through intermediaries and visions, showed Horus a future where the Emperor had become a god, worshipped by a fanatical humanity that had abandoned reason for faith. They showed him the Imperium 10,000 years hence, a dystopian nightmare of endless war, brutal oppression, and religious zealotry. They showed him his brothers reduced to myths and legends, their achievements forgotten or twisted beyond recognition. They showed him himself, forgotten entirely, written out of history as if he had never existed. These visions were not entirely lies. The Chaos Gods, existing outside linear time, could perceive possible futures. The Imperium they showed Horus was one potential timeline, and indeed, it would become the actual timeline following his actions. But they presented these visions with crucial context omitted. They did not explain that this dark future would emerge as a direct consequence of Horus's own betrayal, that the Emperor's internment upon the Golden Throne would result from Horus's assault on Terra, that the Imperium's transformation into a theocratic nightmare would stem from humanity's desperate need for faith after their greatest hero had betrayed them. The Chaos Gods showed Horus the monster he would create, and convinced him it was the monster he needed to prevent. Horus also encountered Magnus the Red during his journey through the warp. His psychically gifted brother attempted to warn him about the trap being prepared, to explain that the visions he was seeing were manipulations designed to turn him against their father. But Magnus's warnings came too late and were too confused. The Crimson King's own relationship with the Emperor had been strained by disagreements about the nature and use of psychic power. His warnings about sorcery and warp entities sounded hypocritical coming from someone who himself practiced such arts. Moreover, Magnus could not directly contradict the visions Horus had seen, for they were not entirely false. All he could offer was context that Horus, in his traumatized and manipulated state, was not prepared to accept. When Horus finally awakened in the temple, he was changed. Outwardly, he appeared recovered, the anatheme's poison purged from his system, his strength restored. His sons rejoiced at his survival, celebrating what they saw as miraculous healing. But those closest to Horus, warriors who had served with him for decades, noticed subtle differences. His smiles seemed forced. His jokes lacked their previous warmth. His eyes, when he thought himself unobserved, held a coldness that had never been there before. The Warmaster they had known, the charismatic leader who inspired through genuine connection and care, had been replaced by something that wore his face but lacked his soul. The corruption did not manifest immediately as open rebellion. Horus was too intelligent, too strategic-minded to simply declare himself traitor and expect his forces to follow. Instead, he began a careful campaign of subversion that would unfold over months. He spoke privately with lodge members, sharing edited versions of his visions, emphasizing the Emperor's apparent plan to abandon the Space Marines once they had served their purpose.
He reached out to brother Primarchs whose relationships with their father had been strained, offering sympathy and suggesting that the Emperor's failures as a father were not their fault but his own. He identified legions and army regiments whose loyalty might be questionable, whose commanders harbored ambitions or resentments that could be exploited. Most critically, Horus began planning the single greatest act of betrayal in human history. He would not merely rebel against the Emperor. He would orchestrate events to ensure that when civil war finally erupted, the loyalist forces would be scattered, weakened, and unable to mount effective resistance. The trap that had caught him on Davin's moon was nothing compared to the trap he now prepared for the Imperium itself. And like Erebus before him, Horus understood that the most effective traps are those the victim walks into willingly, believing they serve some other purpose entirely.
The Betrayal Unleashed, Isstvan III and the Death of Loyalty. The first overt act of the Horus Heresy came not on some distant battlefield, but in the Isstvan system, and it came not against the Emperor, but against the Space Marines themselves. Horus, now fully committed to his rebellion, faced a practical problem that threatened to derail his entire plan. Not every Space Marine in the legions under his command supported his vision. Many remained loyal to the Emperor and the Imperium, their oaths of service unshakable despite Horus's considerable charisma and manipulative skill. These loyalists represented a direct threat to the coming rebellion. If they remained alive when Horus declared himself against the Emperor, they would fight against their own brothers, splitting the traitor legions and potentially dooming the uprising before it properly began. Horus's solution to this problem revealed the depths to which he had fallen. Rather than attempting to convert these loyalists or accepting that his forces would be divided, he decided to eliminate them entirely. The plan he devised was both brilliant and monstrous, exploiting the very loyalty these warriors held sacred to arrange their deaths. The stage for this betrayal was set on Isstvan III, a world in the Isstvan system that had recently declared independence from the Imperium. On the surface, the situation seemed routine. A rebellious world needed to be brought back into compliance. Horus's solution to this problem would lead an expeditionary force to accomplish this task, demonstrating the Warmaster's continued commitment to the Great Crusade. What made this operation different was the composition of forces Horus assigned to the ground assault. He carefully selected companies and warriors from the sons of Horus, World Eaters, Death Guard, and Emperor's Children, choosing specifically those Space Marines whose loyalty to the Emperor remained unquestioned. These were veterans of decades or even centuries of service, warriors who had fought with distinction across countless campaigns, brothers who had earned every honor their legions could bestow. Horus placed them all in the vanguard of the assault on Isstvan III, assuring them that their courage and skill were essential for victory against the rebellious population. The loyalist Space Marines, trusting their Primarch absolutely, deployed to the planet's surface without suspicion. They fought their way through Isstvan's defenses, secured landing zones, established forward positions, and prepared for the second wave that would bring the bulk of Imperial forces to finish the campaign. Everything proceeded according to standard doctrine. The warriors on the ground had no reason to believe this operation differed from countless others they had participated in. Some sources suggest that certain individuals sensed something wrong, noting unusual communications protocols or odd deployment patterns,
But these concerns were easily dismissed as meaningless details amid the chaos of active combat operations. Then the sky caught fire. What occurred next has become known as the firestorm of Isstvan, though that clinical terminology fails to capture the horrific reality of what Horus unleashed upon his own sons. From orbit, the Traitor Legion's warships began a sustained bombardment of the planet's surface. But these were not conventional munitions designed to destroy military targets or infrastructure. They were virus bombs, weapons banned by the Emperor himself as too horrific for use even against the Imperium's worst enemies. The Life Eater virus they contained was a biological weapon of almost unimaginable lethality, designed to consume all organic matter it contacted, reproducing exponentially as it spread.
The virus swept across Isstvan III like a wave of death. It killed the indigenous population in hours. Millions of humans dying in agony as their bodies were consumed from within. But the real targets were the Space Marines on the surface, warriors whose enhanced biology and sealed armor should have protected them against most conventional threats. The Life Eater virus proved capable of penetrating even ceramite battleplate, finding microscopic gaps in seals, overwhelming air filtration systems, reaching the Space Marines inside their armor. Many died instantly, their enhanced physiology unable to cope with the virus's designed lethality. Others survived the initial exposure, only to watch their brothers die around them, helpless to provide aid or comfort. But the virus bombardment was merely the first stage of Horus's betrayal. As the Life Eater consumed all organic matter on the planet, it released massive amounts of flammable gas into the atmosphere. When enough gas had accumulated, the Traitor fleet launched a second wave of bombardment using incendiary weapons. The entire planet's atmosphere ignited in a firestorm that raised surface temperatures to levels that would melt ceramite and vaporize flesh. Those Space Marines who had somehow survived the virus found themselves caught in a literal hell. Their armor's temperature controls overwhelmed, their bodies burning even as they tried desperately to understand what was happening and why. Yet even this double apocalypse failed to kill every loyalist Space Marine on Isstvan III. The Space Marines were among humanity's most resilient creations, and their will to survive proved as extraordinary as their physical capabilities. Those who found shelter in deep bunkers or underground facilities, those whose armor maintained integrity long enough to reach protective positions, those blessed by fortune or fate with locations that somehow escaped the worst of both attacks, survived. In the aftermath, as fires still raged across the planet's surface and the air remained thick with ash and poison, these survivors emerged to discover the magnitude of their Primarch's betrayal. Among the survivors was Captain Garvia Loken of the Sons of Horus, one of the Legion's most respected warriors, and a man who had served with distinction since before Horus was found. He had been part of the Mournival, an informal advisory council to the Warmaster, composed of 4 captains who represented different aspects of the Legion's character. Loken had been the voice of honor and loyalty within that group, and his survival of Isstvan III represented a direct threat to Horus's narrative. If loyalists like Loken lived to reach Terra and testify to what had occurred, Horus's carefully constructed justifications for rebellion would be exposed as the lies they were.
Captain Saul Tarvitz of the Emperor's Children also survived, having discovered the plot hours before the bombardment and attempted to warn his brothers on the surface. Though his warning came too late to save most of the Loyalists, it allowed some to reach shelter before the virus bombs fell. Tarvitz represented everything the Emperor's Children had once aspired to be: honorable, dedicated, committed to perfection through discipline rather than excess. His survival stood as living condemnation of what his legion had become under Fulgrim's corrupted leadership. Among the World Eaters, Captain Erlin survived alongside many of his battle brothers. The 12th Legion had always been the most fractious and difficult to control, their Butcher's Nails augmentations driving them toward violence regardless of strategic considerations. Ironically, these same modifications that made them unstable also made them extraordinarily difficult to kill. World Eaters who would have succumbed to virus or fire simply refused to die, their bodies pushed beyond normal limits by rage and augmentation-induced fury.
The Death Guard saw Captain Nathaniel Garrow survive, along with a contingent of his warriors. Garrow would go on to play a crucial role in the early heresy, escaping Isstvan aboard the frigate Eisenstein and carrying word of Horus's betrayal to Terra. His testimony would be the first confirmation the Emperor received that his most trusted son had turned traitor, and his arrival would trigger the Imperium's desperate mobilization to counter the rebellion before it could gain unstoppable momentum. These survivors, numbering in the thousands rather than the tens of thousands who had deployed to Isstvan III's surface, realized they faced an impossible situation. They were stranded on a devastated world, cut off from any support, facing forces that included not only their own traitor brothers, but potentially the entire expeditionary fleet in orbit above them. They had limited ammunition, damaged equipment, and no hope of reinforcement or evacuation. By any rational assessment, they should have surrendered or simply waited to die. Instead, they chose to fight. What followed was one of the most heroic last stands in Imperial history, though few would ever know the full details. The Loyalist survivors fortified positions in the ruins of Isstvan III's cities, particularly in the remains of the Precentor's palace in the planetary capital of Coral City. They gathered what weapons and ammunition they could salvage from fallen brothers. They organized themselves into coherent fighting units, despite being drawn from multiple legions with different doctrines and traditions. And when Horus, frustrated by their survival and determined to eliminate these witnesses to his treachery, sent ground forces to finish them, they made the traitors pay for every meter of ground in blood. The Battle of Isstvan III lasted for months. The Loyalist survivors, outnumbered and outgunned, employed every tactical advantage they could create. They used their intimate knowledge of space marine warfare to predict and counter traitor tactics. They exploited the ruins of Coral City, turning rubble into fortifications and creating kill zones in devastated streets. They conserved ammunition through disciplined fire control, making every shot count. Most importantly, they maintained absolute unity of purpose. There were no arguments about chain of command, no disputes over tactics, no rivalry between legions. They were brothers who had been betrayed, and they would make their betrayers understand the cost of that betrayal. Horus eventually committed significant ground forces to eliminating the Loyalist holdouts, including elements of his own Sons of Horus.
He could not afford to allow these survivors to endure. Every day they held out was another day his rebellion remained vulnerable to discovery by forces still loyal to the Emperor. But even with overwhelming numerical and material superiority, the traitors found the Loyalists nearly impossible to dislodge. The survivors fought with a desperation and fury born of ultimate betrayal, knowing they would receive no mercy and determined to sell their lives as dearly as possible.
In the end, the Loyalists' defeat came not through superior traitor tactics, but through simple attrition. They ran out of ammunition, their weapons reduced to clubs and knives. They ran out of power for their armor, forcing them to fight in ceramite shells that had become dead weight rather than force multipliers. They ran out of brothers, each death reducing their numbers while traitor forces seemed inexhaustible. Yet even as the final positions fell and the last Loyalists were overwhelmed, they had achieved something extraordinary. They had delayed Horus's rebellion by months, buying precious time for the Imperium to learn of the betrayal and begin organizing resistance. They had proven that loyalty to the Emperor meant more than genetic programming or indoctrination, that it was a choice warriors made and maintained even unto death. And they had forced Horus to commit significant resources to eliminating them, weakening his forces for the larger campaign ahead. The death toll at Isstvan III can never be precisely calculated. Estimates suggest between 20 and 30,000 Loyalist Space Marines deployed to the surface before the bombardment. Of these, perhaps a few hundred escaped the planet entirely, carried away by commanders like Garrow, who recognized the importance of bringing word of the betrayal to Terra. The rest died on that poisoned world, their bodies consumed by virus and fire, their gene seed lost forever, their names eventually forgotten by an Imperium that had more immediate concerns than honoring dead traitors. Yet they were not traitors. They were the last loyal sons of legions that had betrayed everything they once stood for, and their sacrifice deserves to be remembered, even if it never will be. For Horus, Isstvan III represented both success and failure. He had eliminated most of the loyalist elements within his forces, consolidating control over the sons of Horus, World Eaters, Death Guard, and Emperor's children. He had demonstrated his willingness to do whatever was necessary to achieve victory, establishing his credibility with the Chaos Gods as someone who would not hesitate when difficult decisions were required. But he had also revealed his hand before he was fully prepared, forced to act overtly before all pieces were in position. The survivors who escaped to Terra carried evidence of his treachery, giving the Emperor warning that he might not have otherwise received. And the brutal months spent eliminating holdouts on Isstvan III's surface meant months during which the Imperium's loyalist forces could reposition and prepare defenses. Most significantly, Isstvan III established the character of the conflict. This would not be a clean war of ideology, not a dispute that might be resolved through negotiation or compromise. This was fratricide, the most intimate and unforgivable form of betrayal. The Space Marines fighting on both sides had trained together, bled together, celebrated victories, and mourned defeats together. Many had known each other for decades or centuries. And now they were killing one another with a hatred born of broken trust and shattered brotherhood. That hatred, once ignited, would burn for 10,000 years. The Drop Site Massacre, Isstvan V and the Crimson Paths. If Isstvan III was where Horus eliminated loyalists within his own forces, Isstvan V was where he crippled the Imperium's ability to respond to his rebellion. The second Isstvan atrocity stands as perhaps the single bloodiest day in Imperial military history.
a carefully orchestrated trap that destroyed 3 entire Space Marine legions in a single afternoon, and established beyond any doubt that the Horus Heresy would determine the galaxy's fate for millennia to come. After receiving word of Horus's betrayal from Nathaniel Garro and other survivors of Isstvan III, the Emperor faced an impossible strategic situation. Half his Primarchs had apparently turned traitor, taking their legions with them. The full extent of the rebellion remained unclear, as did the loyalties of several Primarchs who had not yet openly declared themselves. Terra was vulnerable, its defenses nowhere near adequate to withstand assault by multiple Space Marine legions. The Great Crusade's very success had scattered Loyalist forces across the galaxy, leaving few concentrated reserves that could be quickly deployed to counter the rebellion. Rogel Dorn, in his capacity as Praetorian of Terra, made the decision to dispatch a 7-legion force to Isstvan V to confront Horus directly. The plan called for initial assault waves composed of the Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard, with follow-up waves provided by the Iron Warriors, Night Lords, Word-Bearers, and Alpha Legion. These latter 4 legions had not yet openly declared for either side, but Dorn had no reason to doubt their loyalty. They had fought for the Emperor for 2 centuries, had shed blood in his name across countless worlds, had earned their positions through undeniable service. That they might betray their oaths seemed unthinkable, which was precisely why Horus's trap proved so devastatingly effective. The Loyalist forces assembled at Isstvan V with the greatest expedition possible, understanding that Horus could not be allowed to consolidate his position or extend his influence to additional legions. The Iron Hands came under their Primarch Ferrus Manus, one of the Emperor's most physically powerful sons, a warrior whose hands had been transformed by living metal into nearly indestructible weapons. Ferrus was also one of Horus's closest brothers, his friendship with the Warmaster predating even the Emperor's discovery of either Primarch. This personal connection made Ferrus uniquely dangerous to Horus's plans, for Ferrus might appeal to whatever remnant of honor or loyalty remained in the Warmaster's corrupted soul. The Salamanders arrived under their Primarch Vulcan, master of the Forge, and perhaps the most humane of all the Primarchs. Vulcan had always emphasized the Space Marines' duty to protect humanity's civilians, viewing the Legiones Astartes as guardians rather than mere warriors. His presence in the Loyalist force represented a direct counter to Horus's increasingly nihilistic worldview, a reminder that power existed to serve rather than dominate. The Raven Guard deployed under their Primarch Corvus Corax, genius of stealth warfare and master of strike and fade tactics. Where other legions favored frontal assault or siege warfare, the Raven Guard specialized in surgical strikes against critical targets. Their methodology could have proven extremely effective against Horus's command structure, potentially eliminating traitor leadership before the rebellion could gain full momentum.
Corvus Corax proved more fortunate. The Raven Guard Primarch recognized the battle as lost far more quickly than his brothers, understanding that staying meant death for himself and his entire legion. He organized fighting withdrawals that extracted portions of his forces from the massacre, sacrificing rear guard units to buy time for others to reach evacuation transports. Even these rescue efforts succeeded only partially.
The vast majority of the Raven Guard died on Isstvan V's Black Sands, but Corax's quick thinking and tactical genius saved several thousand, warriors who would form the core around which the 19th Legion could eventually rebuild. When the guns finally fell silent, when the last loyalist resistance had been crushed, Isstvan V's surface was carpeted with dead Space Marines. The exact casualty figures remain disputed, but conservative estimates suggest over 70,000 Loyalist Space Marines died in the drop site massacre. The Iron Hands were functionally destroyed as a fighting force, reduced to a few thousand survivors scattered across the galaxy. The Salamanders suffered nearly as severely, their legion shattered and their Primarch lost. The Raven Guard, though less damaged thanks to Corax's brilliant retreat, still lost the majority of their strength. The strategic implications proved catastrophic for the Loyalist cause. 3 entire legions had been eliminated from the order of battle in a single afternoon. The traitors had demonstrated they could coordinate complex operations across multiple legions, suggesting a level of organization that made them far more dangerous than any spontaneous rebellion might be. Most critically, the drop site massacre revealed that the Imperium's intelligence regarding who was loyal and who had turned was fatally flawed. If 4 entire legions could hide their treachery until the perfect moment to strike, how many other supposedly loyal forces might actually serve Horus? For Horus, Isstvan V represented his masterwork of strategic deception. He had eliminated 3 legions that would have been central to any loyalist resistance. He had dealt a psychological blow to the Imperium that would resonate for years, proving that the Space Marines were not invincible, that the Emperor's greatest creations could be defeated and destroyed. He had secured breathing room to continue corrupting additional forces, to consolidate his control over the regions his rebellion controlled, to prepare for the eventual march on Terra itself. The drop site massacre turned the Horus Heresy from a rebellion that might be quickly suppressed into a galaxy-spanning civil war that would burn for 7 terrible years. Yet Isstvan V also revealed something crucial about the traitors' fundamental weakness. They had achieved total surprise, perfect positioning, overwhelming numerical superiority, and they had still failed to eliminate all 3 enemy legions. Corvus Corax escaped with thousands. Vulcan lived despite appearing dead. Even the shattered remnants of the Iron Hands would eventually regroup and continue fighting. The massacre demonstrated that while the traitors could win battles through treachery and surprise, they might struggle to achieve the complete victories necessary to actually win the war. This would prove prophetic in the years ahead, as the heresy devolved from quick, decisive victories into grinding attrition that favored neither side absolutely. The site of the massacre on Isstvan V became a monument to betrayal. The black volcanic sands permanently stained with the blood of thousands of Space Marines. In the millennia since, Loyalist chapters have made pilgrimages to Isstvan V, to stand where their gene fathers fell, to understand the price of trust betrayed, to ensure that the lessons of that terrible day are never forgotten. The drop site massacre stands as the definitive proof that even the mightiest warriors can be brought low not by superior enemies, but by treachery from those they called brothers.
The initial assault on Isstvan V proceeded according to plan. The Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard
made planetfall in drop pods and assault carriers, securing landing zones and pushing inland toward Horus's fortified positions. The Sons of Horus and their allied traitor legions mounted fierce resistance, but appeared to be giving ground under the loyalist assault. Reports reaching the second wave forces indicated that the battle was progressing favorably, that the traitors were being driven back, that final victory might require the second wave's fresh reinforcements, but victory itself seemed assured. Then came the moment when everything changed. As the Iron Warriors, Night Lords, Word-Bearers, and Alpha Legion began their deployment, as their ships launched drop pods and landers, as their warriors descended to reinforce what they believed were their loyalist brothers, the trap was sprung. Rather than supporting the first wave's assault, the second wave forces turned their weapons on the Space Marines they were supposed to be reinforcing. At point-blank range, with the element of total surprise, the traitors opened fire on the Salamanders, Raven Guard, and Iron Hands, cutting them down by the thousands in the first minutes of their betrayal. The massacre that followed defies adequate description. The loyalist Space Marines of the first wave found themselves caught between Horus's forces in front and their supposed allies behind, trapped in a killing field with no possibility of escape or reinforcement. Their ships in orbit had already been engaged by traitor vessels, preventing any evacuation or fire support. The battle's outcome was decided in the first moments, but the actual dying would continue for hours as loyalist forces were systematically annihilated. Ferrus Manus, his rage at Horus's betrayal overwhelming his normally sound tactical judgment, led his warriors in a desperate assault on the Warmaster's position. The Primarch of the Iron Hands had always been temperamental, his fury when roused nearly as legendary as Angron's, though he typically kept it under better control. Seeing his closest brother transformed into a traitor, seeing his legion being slaughtered around him, Ferrus lost that control. He drove forward with a fraction of his legion's veterans, determined to either kill Horus and end the heresy before it could truly begin, or die in the attempt. Historical analysis suggests Ferrus might have succeeded if he had coordinated with Vulcan and Corax, if the three Primarchs had combined their strength against the Warmaster. But Ferrus went forward alone, and when he reached Horus's position, it was Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children who awaited him. The duel between Ferrus Manus and Fulgrim represented the death of brotherhood itself. These two Primarchs had been closer than most, their friendship predating even their discovery by the Emperor. They had fought together across countless worlds, celebrated victories, shared their hopes and fears, formed a bond that transcended mere fraternal loyalty. Now they faced each other across a field of slaughter, one faithful to his oaths and the other corrupted beyond redemption. The battle between them proved brief but intense. Two masters of close combat fighting with skills honed over 2 centuries of warfare. In the end, Fulgrim's blade, the demon sword Fireblade, took Ferrus's head in a single stroke. Fulgrim reportedly wept after killing Ferrus, overcome by grief at what he had done, recognizing that he had murdered not merely a brother Primarch, but perhaps his only true friend. Yet his tears came too late, his remorse insufficient to undo the deed. The Iron Hands Primarch was dead, decapitated by the one person in the galaxy he would have least expected to strike him down. His death broke something fundamental in the ex-Legion, inflicting psychological wounds that would never heal. In the millennia since Isstvan, the Iron Hands have never recovered from their Primarch's loss, their entire culture warped by that single moment of ultimate betrayal. Vulcan fought with desperate courage, trying to rally the Salamanders and extract survivors from the killing field.
His immense physical strength and near invulnerability kept him alive when dozens of weapons targeted him simultaneously. But even he could not stand against an entire legion's concentrated firepower. He was eventually brought down, his body so thoroughly destroyed by repeated attacks that he appeared dead. In truth, Vulcan was a perpetual, an immortal who could regenerate from nearly any injury given sufficient time. But his legion did not know this, and believing their father slain, the Salamander's resistance collapsed into desperation and grief.
The path to godhood, Molech, and the Warmaster's transformation. In the months and years following Isstvan, as the heresy spread across the galaxy and battlefronts multiplied beyond counting, Horus found himself facing an uncomfortable reality. Despite his strategic genius, despite commanding half the Space Marine legions and vast armies of corrupted Imperial forces, despite the support of the Chaos Gods themselves, he was not winning. The Loyalists had proven far more resilient than anticipated. Worlds that should have fallen quickly held out for months. Legions that should have been destroyed continued fighting from scattered strongholds. Most critically, the Emperor remained on Terra, organizing defenses, rallying Loyalist forces, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Horus had expected quick victory. His plan called for reaching Terra before the scattered Loyalist legions could return to defend it, for catching the Emperor with minimal forces, for ending the war in a single decisive stroke. But the timeline was slipping. Robout Guilliman was gathering a massive relief force in Ultramar, preparing to march on Terra to break any siege Horus might establish. Lion L. Johnson and the Dark Angels were disengaging from their conflict with the Night Lords in the Thramas Crusade. Even the severely damaged Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard were beginning to reconstitute themselves, forming guerrilla forces that harassed traitor supply lines and forced Horus to divert resources to protect his rear areas. The Warmaster also faced problems within his own coalition. The traitor Primarchs had turned against the Emperor for various reasons, and maintaining unity among such diverse personalities and agendas proved increasingly difficult. Angron cared only for bloodshed and slaughter, showing little interest in strategic objectives unless they involved close combat. Fulgrim had become increasingly erratic after Isstvan V, his legion descending into hedonistic excess that made them unreliable for serious military operations. Mortarion resented any suggestion that he wasn't the rebellion's true leader. Perturabo seethed at what he perceived as inadequate recognition of his contributions. Even among the sons of Horus, some warriors questioned whether the Warmaster's promises of a better Imperium were actually achievable, given the chaos corruption that increasingly permeated the traitor forces. Most troubling for Horus was a growing awareness that the powers he had pledged himself to on Davin were not allies but masters. The Chaos Gods had promised him the strength to defeat the Emperor and remake the Imperium according to his vision. But as the heresy continued, as the influence of the warp grew stronger among the traitor forces, Horus began to understand that Khorne, Tuchent, Nurgle, and Slaanesh had their own agendas. They wanted the Emperor destroyed not to create a better Imperium, but to plunge humanity into eternal darkness, to feast on human souls for eternity, to transform the galaxy into an extension of their horrific domains. Horus had thought he was using chaos as a tool to achieve his goals. He was beginning to suspect that chaos was using him.
It was in this context that Horus made his pilgrimage to Molech, a decision that would fundamentally alter the nature of the heresy and seal the Warmaster's damnation. Molech was an ancient world, one of the very first that humanity had settled during the dark age of technology. It held secrets that predated the Imperium, knowledge from an era when mankind's power had eclipsed even what the Emperor had built. Most significantly, Molech contained a gateway into the warp, a portal that the Emperor himself had once used to bargain with the Chaos Gods for the power he needed to create the Primarchs. The Emperor had visited Molech long before the Great Crusade, before the Unification Wars, perhaps even before he had openly revealed himself to humanity. He had passed through the warp gate and into the domain of chaos itself, confronting the ruinous powers on their own ground. What bargain he struck with them remains unknown, its details lost to history or deliberately concealed. But the results were undeniable. The Emperor returned from that journey with the knowledge and power necessary to create the Primarchs, 20 genetically engineered demigods who would serve as his generals in the reconquest of the galaxy. Horus learned of Molech's significance through sources that remain unclear. Some accounts suggest the Chaos Gods themselves revealed this information, understanding that Horus's journey to Molech would complete his corruption. Others claim that fragments of forbidden knowledge recovered from conquered Xeno-civilizations provided hints that Horus pieced together. Regardless of how he learned about Molech, the Warmaster became convinced that the world held the key to victory. If the Emperor had gained the power to create the Primarchs by passing through Molech's gate, then Horus could gain similar or greater power by following the same path.
The campaign to reach Molech proved brutal. The world was heavily defended, protected not merely by conventional imperial forces, but by night houses whose loyalty to the Emperor dated back millennia. The defenders understood that Molech held something precious, though most did not know exactly what they were protecting. They fought with desperate courage, knowing that if they failed, something terrible would be unleashed. But courage alone could not stand against the combined might of multiple traitor legions supported by demonic forces. After weeks of savage fighting, Horus's forces broke through to the gate's location. What happened next has been the subject of intense speculation and debate for 10,000 years. Horus passed through the gate, accompanied by a small group of his most trusted warriors, including Malohurst, his equerry, and several members of the Mournival that had replaced the old council following Loken's presumed death at Isstvan III. They entered the warp itself, walking through a realm where physical laws held no meaning, where time flowed backward or not at all, where thoughts became reality and reality was merely suggestion. Normal humans would have been driven instantly insane by such exposure. Even space marines would have struggled to maintain their identities amid the chaos. But Horus and his companions endured, driven by will and desperation. Within the warp, Horus confronted the Chaos Gods directly, something only the Emperor had previously dared. The details of these confrontations remain unknown, perhaps unknowable, for the warp does not operate according to rules that allow for reliable documentation. But the outcome proved clear enough. Where the Emperor had bargained with chaos and emerged still himself, still in control of his faculties and purposes, Horus surrendered to it completely. He offered himself as a vessel for the ruinous powers, accepting their corruption in exchange for the strength he believed he needed to defeat his father.
The transformation was not instantaneous. Horus emerged from the gate still recognizably himself, still capable of speech and strategic thought, still able to command his forces. But something fundamental had changed. The last remnants of the man who had been the Emperor's first found son, who had fought for 2 centuries to build the Imperium, who had genuinely believed he was doing the right thing even as he turned traitor, were burned away. What remained was a shell inhabited by powers that cared nothing for Horus's vision of a better Imperium, nothing for his ambitions or dreams, nothing even for Horus himself. He had become a weapon that the Chaos Gods would use to wound the Emperor, and once that weapon had served its purpose, it would be discarded without a second thought. The physical changes manifested gradually over subsequent months. Horus grew larger, his already imposing frame swelling to even more inhuman proportions. His armor fused with his flesh, becoming an extension of his body rather than protection worn over it. His features, which had once been considered handsome in a stern, patrician way, took on a cruel cast that made even his own sons uncomfortable to look upon directly. His eyes, which had sparkled with intelligence and warmth, became cold and distant, windows into something vast and terrible that wore the Warmaster's face like a mask. More disturbing were the changes in behavior and capability. Horus began demonstrating psychic powers that none of the Primarchs, save Magnus, had previously shown. He could reach across vast distances to communicate with his forces telepathically. He could perceive possible futures with accuracy that rivaled the most powerful Farseers. He could manipulate reality itself in small ways, causing weapons to malfunction, making shadows come alive, inspiring terror in enemies simply through proximity. These powers made him more effective as a military commander, but also more alien, more incomprehensible to those who served under him. The sons of Horus responded to their Primarch's transformation with a mixture of awe and unease. They had followed Horus into rebellion because they believed in him, because they trusted his judgment and shared his vision. Now they found themselves following something that barely resembled the father they had known. But retreat was impossible. They had committed the ultimate treachery, betraying the Emperor and slaughtering loyalist brothers. There could be no forgiveness, no reconciliation, no return to what they had been before Isstvan. They could only follow Horus forward into whatever darkness awaited, because the alternative was destruction at the hands of enemies who would show them no mercy. The other traitor Primarchs noticed the change as well. Some, like Lorgar and Fulgrim, celebrated it as apotheosis, the Warmaster finally embracing his true potential free from the Emperor's limiting influence. Others, particularly Perturabo and Mortarion, grew increasingly concerned. They had rebelled for various reasons, but neither had intended to become slaves to warp entities. Seeing what Horus was becoming, understanding that similar fates might await them if they continued down this path, they began to question whether the price of victory might be too high. Yet they too were trapped, committed beyond any possibility of turning back, forced to see the heresy through to whatever end awaited. For the Imperium's loyalist forces, Molech represented a turning point. After the pilgrimage, Horus became noticeably more dangerous. His strategies grew more unpredictable, as if he possessed information about loyalist movements that should have been impossible to acquire. His forces fought with renewed ferocity, as if inspired by their Warmaster's transformation rather than disturbed by it. Most critically, demonic manifestations increased dramatically across all theaters where the sons of Horus fought, as if Horus's presence created tears in reality through which the warp could more easily intrude.
The fall of Molech also had symbolic significance. The world where the Emperor had gained the power to create the Primarchs had now become the place where his first found son completed his transformation into something monstrous. It represented the complete inversion of the Imperium's founding myth, the replacement of hope with horror, the death of the dream that enlightened tyranny could lift humanity to godhood without paying the price in souls. Everything the Emperor had built, all his careful plans and grand visions, were crumbling not because they were attacked by external enemies, but because they had been corrupted from within by his own greatest creation. Yet even in his transformed state, even with the power of all four chaos gods flowing through him, Horus had not achieved invincibility. He had gained immense power, but he had also accelerated his own corruption. The chaos gods were consuming him from within, burning through his essence to fuel their own purposes. He was becoming less a person and more a conduit, less the Warmaster and more a daemon prince. Wearing human form, this process would continue throughout the remainder of the heresy, each victory purchased at the cost of more of Horus's humanity. Each use of his newfound powers bringing him closer to total dissolution into the entities he served. The pilgrimage to Molech marked the point of no return. Before it, Horus might possibly have turned back, might have recognized the magnitude of his error and sought some form of redemption. After it, such possibilities ceased to exist. He was committed utterly to the destruction of the Emperor and the Imperium, not because he still believed in his original vision, but because the powers inhabiting his flesh demanded it. The last vestiges of the honorable warrior, the beloved Primarch, the charismatic leader who had inspired absolute loyalty, were gone. What remained was the arch-traitor, the Warmaster of chaos, the enemy against whom all of humanity would unite in desperate defense. March on Terra, the Solar War and humanity's last stand. In the years following Molech, the Horus Heresy reached its crescendo as traitor forces consolidated their conquests and prepared for the ultimate objective, Terra itself. The march toward humanity's homeworld was not a simple military campaign, but a race against time, with Horus attempting to reach Terra before Loyalist reinforcements could arrive, while simultaneously dealing with resistance from Loyalist forces throughout the regions his rebellion controlled. The strategic situation heavily favored neither side absolutely. Horus commanded approximately half the Space Marine legions, vast numbers of corrupted Imperial Army regiments, significant portions of the Mechanicum following the Civil War on Mars, and the support of the Chaos Gods themselves. His forces had momentum and initiative, choosing where and when to strike. But the Imperium still controlled Terra, Mars's loyalist forges, and several intact legions that had either escaped destruction at Isstvan or had been too far from the fighting to be caught in the initial betrayals. Most significantly, Robote Guilliman was gathering what would become known as Imperium Secundus in Ultramar, assembling a massive force built around his legion and incorporating survivors from other shattered legions.
If Guilliman's relief force reached Terra before Horus could breach the Imperial Palace, the war might turn decisively against the rebels. The word-bearers had worked to delay Guilliman through various means, including the Calth atrocity that severely bloodied the Ultramarines, but the Lord of Macragge remained unbroken and determined to reach Terra. The traitor advance towards Sol proceeded along multiple axes, with different legions assigned to secure key routes and eliminate strong points that might threaten supply lines. The sons of Horus formed the spearhead, their Warmaster driving them forward with intensity that bordered on desperation. Behind them came the other traitor legions, each pursuing objectives aligned with their Primarch's particular obsessions. The World Eaters sought battles where they could slake their endless thirst for blood. The Death Guard methodically reduced fortress worlds that blocked critical warp routes. The Emperor's Children raided systems more for sport than strategic purpose, spreading terror and chaos wherever they appeared. As traitor forces approached the solar system, they found that Rogel Dorn had not been idle during the years since Horus's betrayal. The Praetorian of Terra had transformed the Sol system into perhaps the most heavily fortified location in the galaxy. Pluto's orbital stations bristled with weapons capable of crippling capital ships. Neptune and Uranus anchored defensive lines designed to channel any attacking fleet through predetermined engagement zones. Saturn's moons hosted defensive stations and fleet anchorages. Jupiter served as a staging area for mobile reserves. Mars, though partially corrupted, remained contested between loyalist and traitor Mechanicum factions. Luna itself had been fortified extensively. And behind all these defenses stood Terra, the throne world, protected by the most formidable defensive installations humanity could devise. The Solar War, as the campaign to breach these defenses became known, proved one of the most complex military operations in the Heresy. It was not a single battle, but rather a series of interconnected engagements fought across the entire solar system over a period of months. Naval actions predominated, for the traitors needed to establish orbital supremacy before they could land ground forces. But even these void battles differed from conventional naval warfare, for both sides deployed weapons and tactics that would have been unthinkable before the Heresy.
The first major engagement occurred at Pluto, where the Alpha Legion had previously infiltrated and compromised many defensive systems. First Captain Sigismund initially commanded the defensive forces, but Rogel Dorn himself took charge when intelligence suggested that the Primarch Alfarius was present. The battle that followed has been disputed by historians ever since. Official Imperial records claim that Dorn and Alfarius dueled on Hydra's moon, with the Imperial Fists Primarch slaying the Alpha Legion's Genefather. However, the Alpha Legion's mastery of deception has cast permanent doubt on this account. Some believe it was actually Omegon, Alfarius's twin, who fell. Others suggest the fallen Primarch was merely a convincing body double. The truth remains elusive, characteristic of everything involving the XX Legion. Regardless of who actually died, Pluto's fall compromised Sol's outer defenses. The traitor fleet pressed inward, encountering increasingly fierce resistance at each successive defensive line. The battle for the Jupiter-Saturn region proved particularly savage, with Perturabo's tactical genius on full display, as he identified weaknesses in Dorn's carefully constructed defensive network. Thousands of ships on both sides were destroyed in running battles that lasted weeks. The void itself became hazardous, with debris fields, radiation clouds, and spatial anomalies created by weapons that tapped into forces humanity barely understood. Luna held out longer than most positions,
its extensive fortifications and garrison forces making it extremely difficult to reduce. But eventually, even Luna fell to an assault led by First Captain Abaddon of the Sons of Horus. The loss of Luna was particularly devastating psychologically, for it represented humanity's first step beyond Terra, the launching point from which the Great Crusade had departed to reunite the scattered remnants of mankind's empire. Its fall meant that traitor forces were now literally at Terra's doorstep, capable of landing troops directly to the throne world surface. Perhaps the most strategically significant loss during the Solar War was Mars itself. The Red Planet had been partially controlled by traitor Mechanicum forces since the earliest days of the Heresy, when Fabricator General Kelbor Hal had declared for Horus and plunged Mars into civil war. But Loyalist forces under Fabricator Locum Kane had maintained control over significant portions of Mars's manufacturing capabilities, denying them to the traitors while producing weapons and equipment for Terra's defense. The final battle for Mars saw these last Loyalist strongholds overwhelmed, giving Horus secure control over the solar system's primary manufacturing center. Mars' fall had implications beyond simple industrial capacity. It meant the traitors could produce ammunition, spare parts, and equipment without relying on supply lines stretching back across the galaxy. It meant they could maintain a prolonged siege of Terra without worrying about running out of supplies. Most critically, it meant they could bring the full might of the Dark Mechanicum's corrupted forge complexes to bear in creating siege engines, demon engines, and other horrors specifically designed to break Terra's defenses. During these months of fighting throughout the solar system, Horus himself remained relatively removed from direct combat. He directed operations from his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, coordinating the actions of multiple legions and managing the complex logistics of sustaining such a vast military force. But those who served close to the Warmaster reported that he seemed distracted, as if only part of his attention focused on the immediate military campaign, while the rest contemplated something else entirely. His physical transformation continued, his appearance becoming increasingly inhuman, his behavior growing more erratic and difficult to predict. The truth was that Horus was preparing for something beyond mere military conquest. His time in the warp during the Molech pilgrimage had shown him possibilities that transcended conventional victory. He was not simply planning to kill the Emperor and seize control of the Imperium. He intended something far more ambitious and terrible. The exact nature of his ultimate goal remains unclear even now, lost in the confusion of those final days before the Siege of Terra began. But fragments of evidence suggest he believed he could ascend to full daemon princehood, while simultaneously destroying the Empire's works, creating some new order that would replace both the Imperium and the Chaos Gods themselves. This grandiosity, this belief that he could somehow use the Chaos Gods' power while remaining independent of their will, represented the final delusion of a mind consumed by corruption. Horus had convinced himself that he was still in control, still pursuing his own goals, still the master of his own fate. He could not or would not recognize that he had become merely an instrument, a weapon that the ruinous powers would use to wound the Emperor before discarding him like a broken blade. Even now, at the very end, Horus's pride blinded him to the reality of his situation. By the time the traitor fleet established orbit around Terra, the strategic situation had crystallized into its final configuration. Horus commanded overwhelming force, including 8 full Space Marine legions, though some, like the Emperor's children, were becoming increasingly unreliable. He had secured the solar system's major strategic points, he had cut Terra off from external reinforcement. Most critically, he had arrived before Guilliman's relief force, buying himself time to reduce Terra's defenses before facing the Loyalist counterattack that he knew was coming. But Rogel Dorn had also succeeded in his mission. He had bought time for the Emperor to prepare, for Terra's defenders to organize, for the Imperial Palace to be transformed into a fortress that could withstand even Space Marine assault. He had ensured that Sanguinius and his Blood Angels reached Terra to reinforce the defense. He had preserved the Loyalist fleet's core strength, maintaining naval assets that could contest orbital space and potentially support any relief force that managed to reach Sol. Most importantly, he had demonstrated that the Imperium would not surrender, would not negotiate, would fight to the last breath rather than accept Horus's vision of a better order. The stage was set for the final confrontation. On one side stood Horus Lupercal, the arch-traitor, the Warmaster of Chaos, commanding forces capable of conquering worlds and leading warriors who had forsaken everything they once held sacred. On the other stood the Emperor of Mankind, the Master of Humanity, the anathema to chaos, defending not merely Terra, but the dream that humanity could achieve enlightenment through reason rather than being consumed by the darkness of old night. Between these two titans would be fought a battle that would determine humanity's fate for the next 10,000 years, a siege that would become legend, a conflict where gods walked among men, and the price of defeat was eternal damnation.
The siege, Terra's walls, and the death of hope. When the traitor fleet achieved orbit around Terra, the bombardment began within hours. For 30 days and nights, the sky burned as lance strikes and macro shells rained down upon humanity's homeworld. The Imperial Palace's void shields, perhaps the most powerful defensive array ever constructed, held against the worst of this onslaught. But beyond the palace's protection, unshielded regions suffered catastrophic damage. Hive cities were reduced to rubble. Ancient monuments that had stood for millennia were obliterated in seconds. Billions of civilians died in those first terrible days, their deaths mere collateral damage in a conflict that measured casualties in percentages rather than individual lives. The Death Guard claimed the honor of being the first traitor legion to make planetfall, emerging from their plague-ridden vessels in clouds of toxic miasma. Their arrival marked the transition from bombardment to ground assault, the beginning of the siege proper. Behind them came the other traitor legions, each seeking to prove their worth to the Warmaster, each determined to be the force that finally broke through to the Sanctum Imperialis and killed the Emperor. Terra's defenders had prepared as thoroughly as time allowed. Rogel Dorn had transformed the Imperial Palace from an administrative center into a fortress continent, its walls rising kilometers high, its interior structured as concentric defensive rings designed to bleed attackers at every step. The Imperial fists anchored the defense, approximately 75,000 Astartes positioned at critical points throughout the palace complex. The White Scars provided mobile reserves, ready to respond to any breakthrough. The Blood Angels held key defensive positions, their unmatched skill in close combat perfectly suited to the grinding battles Dorn anticipated. Supporting these three legions came 10,000 custodians, thousands of Sisters of Silence, multiple Titan legions, and approximately 2 million Imperial Army soldiers drawn from regiments across the galaxy. Against these defenders came forces that seemed inexhaustible. 8 traitor legions, though only 7 participated with any consistency after the Emperor's children became distracted by atrocities against civilians. Countless corrupted Imperial Army regiments, their loyalty twisted by promises of power or simply by the desperation of being too compromised to ever return to the Imperium's embrace.
Dark Mechanicum war engines and demon engines, grotesque fusions of metal and flesh that defied both reason and sanity. And, increasingly, as the siege continued and the Emperor's psychic barriers weakened under sustained assault, demons manifested directly on Terra's surface, nightmares made flesh that terrorized defenders and consumed souls. The siege did not proceed as a single coordinated assault, but rather as dozens of simultaneous engagements fought across the palace's vast perimeter. At Lion's Gate Spaceport, Lord Seneschal Fafnir Ran commanded 18,000 Imperial fists in defense of Terra's primary orbital connection point. The port's capture was Perturabao's primary objective, recognizing its strategic value. The Iron Warrior's Primarch deployed his legion with characteristic ruthless efficiency, combining precise artillery bombardment with targeted breacher assaults that exploited structural weaknesses in the spaceport's defenses. The battle for Lionsgate lasted days, with each level of the massive structure being fought over meter by meter. Fafnir Ran orchestrated a fighting withdrawal that military historians would later recognize as brilliance itself, extracting maximum casualties from the attacking Iron Warriors while preserving his own forces for future battles. But eventually, the numbers told. Lionsgate fell to the traitors, its loss opening a major breach in Terra's defenses and allowing traitor titans to deploy directly to the surface. Yet the White Scars refused to accept Lionsgate as permanently lost. Jagatai Khan, true to his legion's nature, planned a lightning counterattack to reclaim the spaceport. Operation Dawn, launched in the pre-dawn hours to catch the traitor garrison at their lowest alertness, succeeded spectacularly. The White Scars struck from multiple vectors simultaneously. Their jet bikes bypassed established defensive lines to hit command nodes directly. Within hours, the Legion's banners flew from Lionsgate's highest towers, signaling an impossible victory that proved the traitors were not invincible. The recapture of Lionsgate, though ultimately temporary, provided a crucial psychological boost to Terra's defenders. It demonstrated that offensive action remained possible, that the Loyalists retained the capability to strike back rather than merely enduring punishment. More importantly, it disrupted Horus's timetable, forcing the traitors to commit additional resources to securing what they had already conquered, rather than pressing forward to new objectives. As the siege entered its second month, the fighting took on characteristics of sustained attrition. Neither side could achieve breakthrough sufficient to end the conflict decisively. The traitors threw waves of forces against the palace defenses, accepting horrific casualties in exchange for incremental gains. The defenders fought with desperate courage, knowing that every hour they held was another hour for Guilliman's relief force to approach Terra. The casualties mounted into the hundreds of thousands, then millions, then numbers so vast that individual deaths ceased to have meaning beyond their contribution to the grinding mathematics of warfare.
The defenders' greatest vulnerability proved to be not military, but metaphysical. The Emperor, even while physically present within the Sanctum Imperialis, maintained a vast psychic barrier called the Aegis that prevented mass daemon manifestation within the palace complex. This defense required constant concentration and drained resources the Emperor desperately needed for other purposes, particularly his ongoing attempt to secure the Imperial Webway portal beneath the palace. The Dark Mechanism, working with word-bearer sorcerers, deployed devices specifically designed to stress the Aegis's structural integrity, creating interference patterns that slowly weakened the Emperor's protections. The Aegis finally collapsed on the 35th day of the siege.
Reality fractured across multiple points simultaneously, as the barrier between material space and the warp thinned to nothing. Greater daemons manifested throughout the palace complex, leading hordes of lesser creatures in assaults that ignored conventional defensive positions entirely. The bloodthirster Kabanda, who had previously battled Sanguinius in the Cygnus cluster, manifested specifically to complete his interrupted contest with the Blood Angels Primarch. The psychological impact of daimonic manifestation proved as devastating as the physical threat, for even veteran Space Marines found their resolve tested by entities that defied natural law. With the Aegis collapsed, the character of the siege changed fundamentally. What had been conventional military operations became something closer to apocalypse. Defenders found themselves fighting not merely traitor Space Marines and corrupted army soldiers, but nightmares given form, creatures whose very existence undermined sanity. Specialized assets like the Sisters of Silence and Custodian anti-daemon units became critically important, stretched beyond their limits trying to contain breaches across the entire palace complex. The physical and metaphysical crises reached their peak simultaneously when Dies Irae, an Imperator-class Titan of the Legio Mortis, concentrated all its firepower on a section of the ultimate wall that separated the outer palace from the inner sanctums. After sustained bombardment, the wall breached, creating a gap through which traitor forces poured in overwhelming numbers. Rogel Dorn, recognizing that the outer palace could no longer be held, ordered a general withdrawal to the inner defenses. This retreat required abandoning thousands of wounded and conceding vast swaths of territory that his forces had held at terrible cost. The fall of the outer palace marked the siege's climax. Traitor forces had finally broken through the first major defensive layer and were advancing toward the Eternity Gate, the final barrier protecting the Sanctum Imperialis itself. The defenders consolidated around this last position, understanding that if the Eternity Gate fell, nothing would stand between Horus and the Emperor. The question was no longer whether Terra's defenses would hold, but rather how long they could delay the inevitable before Guilliman arrived with his relief force. Into this context of mounting desperation came an inexplicable development. The Vengeful Spirit, Horus's flagship and the center of traitor command, suddenly powered down its void shields while hanging in low orbit over the palace. Sensor operators across Terra stared at their displays in disbelief, confirming again and again that the vessel was genuinely vulnerable. It made no tactical sense. No commander would expose his flagship, especially not when victory seemed within reach. Yet there it hung, defenseless, an unmistakable invitation. The senior loyalist commanders immediately recognized this for what it was, a trap. Horus was offering himself as bait, attempting to lure the Emperor into a confrontation aboard the Vengeful Spirit where the Warmaster would hold every advantage. The rational response would be to ignore this obvious provocation, to maintain the defense and wait for Guilliman's arrival. But strategic calculations gave way to desperate reality. Intelligence suggested Horus was preparing a ritual that could destabilize the Imperial webway beyond even the Emperor's ability to contain, potentially transforming Terra itself into a daemon world. The defenders were exhausted, their numbers dwindling, their ammunition reserves depleting. Most critically, the Emperor recognized that some confrontations cannot be avoided or delayed, that sometimes the only path forward leads through the darkness rather than around it. The decision was made. The Emperor would lead a teleport assault directly onto the Vengeful Spirit, accompanied by his most trusted sons and an elite strike force. This choice risked everything on a single desperate gamble, but no alternatives remained that offered better odds. As preparations began for the teleport assault, those involved understood they were witnessing history's pivot point. What happened aboard the Vengeful Spirit would determine not merely the heresy's outcome, but humanity's fate for millennia to come.
Final confrontation. The Vengeful Spirit and the Death of Dreams. The strike force assembled for the teleport assault represented the absolute pinnacle of Imperial military capability. The Emperor himself, clad in golden armor that had not been worn since the Great Crusade's early days, carrying his flaming sword and radiating psychic power visible even to non-sensitives. Accompanying him came two loyal Primarchs, Sanguinius of the Blood Angels, whose precognitive visions had shown him his own death, but who came anyway, and Rogel Dorn of the Imperial Fists, selected for his unwavering resolve and tactical brilliance. Supporting these three demigods came approximately 200 elite warriors, Terminator-armored veterans of the Imperial Fists and Blood Angels, a contingent of custodians under Constantine Valdor, and various specialists, including tech adepts to secure critical ship systems. The teleportation commenced near midnight Terran Standard Time, utilizing protocols the Emperor had designed specifically to penetrate the Vengeful Spirit's formidable defenses. But Horus had anticipated this approach. Drawing on powers granted by all four Chaos Gods, he manipulated the teleportation coordinates, deliberately scattering the boarding party throughout the massive vessel. The Emperor, Sanguinius, and Dorn materialized in widely separated sections, isolated from one another and from their supporting forces. This was the trap's first layer, denying the Loyalists any chance to combine their strength against the Warmaster. Those who materialized aboard the Vengeful Spirit discovered that the vessel had undergone grotesque transformation. What had once been a masterpiece of Imperial naval architecture had become a temple to chaos, a place where physical space bent according to warp logic rather than natural law. Corridors shifted configuration as warriors traversed them. Rooms connected in ways that should have been spatially impossible. The very walls seemed to breathe, pulsing with unnatural life. Time itself became unreliable, with some reporting that minutes stretched into hours, while others experienced hours passing in what felt like seconds. Sanguinius reached Horus first, his precognitive abilities allowing him to navigate the ship's impossible geometry more effectively than his brothers. The Blood Angels Primarch found the Warmaster waiting on what had once been the command bridge, a vast chamber, now transformed into a throne room, where Horus sat in terrible majesty. The creature that awaited Sanguinius barely resembled the brother he had loved. Horus had swollen to inhuman size, his armor fused with corrupted flesh, his eyes burning with power that was no longer remotely human. Yet when he spoke, his voice retained some echo of the charisma that had once inspired absolute loyalty. The confrontation began not with violence, but with conversation. Horus genuinely attempted to sway Sanguinius to his cause, offering power, freedom from the genetic curse that plagued the Blood Angels,
protection from the dark future the angel had foreseen. This represented Horus's last attempt at the manipulation that had once been his greatest strength. If he could turn Sanguinius, the most beloved of all Primarchs, the warrior whose nobility inspired even enemies to admiration, then perhaps the corruption that had consumed half the legions might spread further still. But Sanguinius refused, not with anger or condemnation, but with profound sorrow for what his brother had become. The angel saw through the offers of power to the emptiness beneath, recognized that whatever entity wore Horus's face was no longer truly his brother, but rather a vessel for forces that cared nothing for any individual's hopes or dreams. This refusal, delivered with compassion rather than contempt, apparently wounded Horus more deeply than any sword thrust could have. The Warmaster's face twisted with rage, and the pretense of civil discourse ended. The battle between them was not prolonged. Despite his exhaustion from weeks of continuous combat, despite the wounds he had already sustained defending Terra, Sanguinius fought with skill and ferocity that would have overwhelmed any lesser opponent. His speed allowed him to evade strikes that would have bisected him. His precision let him find gaps in Horus's corrupted armor. He actually managed to wound the Warmaster multiple times, drawing blood that burned with unnatural fire, proving that even a being empowered by all 4 Chaos Gods could still be hurt.
But ultimately, the gulf in power proved too vast. Horus had become something beyond even a Primarch, augmented by gifts from entities that had existed since before humanity's ancestors first walked upright. After a battle whose duration remains disputed in various accounts, Horus seized Sanguinius and broke him. The exact details vary depending on which source one consults, but most reliable accounts indicate the Warmaster utilized his lightning claw, the talon of Horus, to deliver multiple devastating wounds before finally crushing the angel's throat in his bare hands. Sanguinius died as he had lived, with nobility and grace. Even in his final moments, facing a brother so corrupted he was barely recognizable, the angel offered no curses or recriminations. He simply closed his eyes and accepted his fate, his last thoughts reportedly being of his legion and his hope that his death might buy enough time for the emperor to arrive. In the 10 millennia since that moment, the Blood Angels have never forgotten. The death of Sanguinius at Horus's hands created a wound in the 9th Legion's collective soul that manifests as the Black Rage, a curse that causes Blood Angels to relive their Primarch's final moments, experiencing his death again and again in an endless cycle of trauma and fury. The Emperor arrived less than an hour after Sanguinius fell, his path to the throne room having been delayed by substantial traitor resistance. What he discovered has been rendered in countless imperial artworks over the millennia, though none capture the emotional reality. The master of mankind found his most noble son dead at the feet of his most beloved, the angel's broken body discarded like refuse, his magnificent wings torn and bloodied, his face frozen in an expression of sorrowful acceptance. The emperor knelt briefly beside Sanguinius, one hand gently closing those sightless eyes, a father's final gesture of tenderness for a fallen son. Then he rose, and as he did, golden light began to suffuse him until he seemed more force than person, more concept than individual. The temperature in the throne room dropped as psychic power gathered.
the very air crackling with energies that made reality itself protest. The Emperor's grief transformed into something colder and far more terrible than mere anger. The duel between father and son was fought on multiple levels simultaneously. In the physical realm, the Emperor wielded his flaming sword against Horus's corrupted weapons. Each clash of their weapons released energy discharges that would have vaporized ordinary humans. In the psychic realm, they waged war across dimensions that human senses cannot perceive, attacking each other's minds and souls even as their bodies fought. The Vengeful Spirit itself began to tear apart around them, unable to withstand the forces being unleashed within its hull. The critical detail, the one that would determine the battle's outcome and seal both their fates, was that the Emperor fought with restraint. Despite everything Horus had done, despite the betrayal and the billions dead and the Imperium torn apart, the Emperor could not bring himself to unleash his full power against the son he had loved above all others. Some part of him still hoped for redemption, still believed that perhaps the real Horus remained somewhere within the corrupted shell, still clung to the possibility that this nightmare might somehow end without requiring him to destroy his own creation. This hesitation proved nearly fatal. Horus, offering no such restraint, fought with the full might of chaos channeled through his transformed body. He struck the Emperor again and again, each blow empowered by entities that had plotted humanity's downfall since the species first achieved sentience. The accounts of the Emperor's injuries vary in their specifics, but all agree on their severity. Horus opened the Emperor's chest, nearly bisecting him. He severed critical arteries and destroyed organs. He landed blows that would have killed any other being instantly, even another Primarch. The accounts converge on what happened next. Horus raised the Emperor overhead and broke his back across his knee, a brutal recreation of techniques the Primarchs themselves had used in combat. The master of mankind, the being who had walked among humanity for tens of thousands of years, who had guided mankind through old night and built the Imperium that spanned the galaxy, lay broken and defeated. His physical body was so catastrophically damaged that even his extraordinary regenerative capabilities could not compensate. He was helpless, unable to move, unable to defend himself, at the mercy of a son who had become merciless. In this moment of apparent total victory, Horus made his final mistake. Rather than finishing the Emperor immediately, he paused to gloat, to explain how he would remake humanity in his own image while the Emperor watched, powerless to intervene. This was not merely cruelty, it represented Horus's desperate need for validation, his yearning for the Emperor to acknowledge that the rebellion had been justified, that Horus's vision of a better Imperium was worth the price paid in blood and souls. This hesitation proved nearly fatal. Horus, offering no such restraint, fought with the full might of chaos channeled through his transformed body. He struck the Emperor again and again, each blow empowered by entities that had plotted humanity's downfall since the species first achieved sentience. The accounts of the Emperor's injuries vary in their specifics, but all agree on their severity. Horus opened the Emperor's chest, nearly bisecting him. He severed critical arteries and destroyed organs. He landed blows that would have killed any other being instantly, even another Primarch. The accounts converge on what happened next. Horus raised the Emperor overhead and broke his back across his knee, a brutal recreation of techniques the Primarchs themselves had used in combat. The master of mankind, the being who had walked among humanity for tens of thousands of years, who had guided mankind through old night and built the Imperium that spanned the galaxy, lay broken and defeated. His physical body was so catastrophically damaged that even his extraordinary regenerative capabilities could not compensate. He was helpless, unable to move, unable to defend himself, at the mercy of a son who had become merciless. In this moment of apparent total victory, Horus made his final mistake. Rather than finishing the emperor immediately, he paused to gloat, to explain how he would remake humanity in his own image while the emperor watched, powerless to intervene. This was not merely cruelty, it represented Horus's desperate need for validation, his yearning for the emperor to acknowledge that the rebellion had been justified, that Horus's vision of a better Imperium was worth the price paid in blood and souls.
But as Horus spoke, something changed. Brief flickers of recognition crossed his features. Momentary glimpses of the man he had been before Davin, before chaos, before corruption had consumed him utterly. For an instant, perhaps less, the real Horus surfaced, recognizing the horror of what he had become and what he had done. This moment of clarity, of the original Horus briefly reasserting himself against the entities inhabiting his flesh, created a vulnerability in Chaos's hold upon him. It was then that the final catalyst arrived. The exact identity of this figure remains one of the heresy's most contested mysteries. The most ancient accounts describe a single Imperial army soldier, a baseline human displaying unimaginable courage by interposing himself between the Warmaster and the fallen Emperor. Later revisions identify this figure as a custodian warrior. Still others suggest a Terminator-armored Imperial Fists veteran. Some inquisitorial texts claim it was Olanius Person, a perpetual who had fought alongside the Emperor during humanity's earliest ages, and who had somehow survived across millennia to stand at his master's side one final time. Whoever this figure was, their intervention changed everything. They stepped between Horus and the Emperor, knowing they had no chance of survival, knowing their sacrifice would be meaningless in military terms, choosing nonetheless to stand in defense of a being they could not possibly protect. Horus, his attention drawn by this futile gesture, casually obliterated the intervening figure. Not killed, but utterly annihilated, reduced to component atoms with a negligent gesture that demonstrated the vast gulf between mortal and God. This casual brutality, this effortless destruction of a being so hopelessly outmatched, served as the Emperor's moment of terrible clarity. He saw in that instant that Horus was truly gone, that whatever creature wore his son's face retained nothing of the honor, compassion, or nobility that had once defined the Warmaster. The original Horus might have been redeemed. This thing could not be. More importantly, the Emperor recognized that any continued hesitation, any further attempts at mercy, would doom not merely himself, but all of humanity to eternal suffering under Chaos's dominion. The decision the Emperor made in that moment cost him everything. He gathered his remaining psychic strength, drawing on reserves that would have destroyed any other being who attempted to channel them, and unleashed his full, unrestrained power directly at Horus, not merely attacking the Warmaster's body, but his soul. Not merely killing him, but unmaking him, erasing him so completely that even the Chaos Gods could not recover what was destroyed. The psychic shockwave from this ultimate attack rippled through the warp,
temporarily disrupting chaos power across the entire solar system. Demons manifested throughout Terra were banished back to the Imperium. Chaos-enhanced weapons suddenly failed. The sky cleared of unnatural storms. For a brief moment, reality itself reasserted dominance over the forces that had been corrupting it. But the victory was Pyrrhic. The Emperor had prevailed, but at catastrophic personal cost. The psychic expenditure, combined with his grievous physical injuries, left him mortally wounded. His godlike powers were barely sufficient to maintain basic life functions. As his consciousness began to fade, he was dimly aware of loyal sons arriving, of being carried from the Vengeful Spirit, of Terra's defenders celebrating their impossible survival even as their master died in their arms. The Warmaster of Chaos was dead, but so, in every way that mattered, was the Emperor of mankind.
The Emperor enthroned, and the long darkness. The immediate aftermath of Horus's death saw the traitor forces collapse into chaos. The metaphysical backlash from the Warmaster's destruction severed the chains of command that had held the rebellion together. Without Horus to coordinate their efforts, the traitor Primarchs immediately began competing for dominance. Mortarion claimed authority over ground operations. Perturabo asserted command of void assets. Neither recognized the other's legitimacy. Abaddon gathered the remnants of the sons of Horus, his grief over his father's death manifesting as cold fury. But even he lacked the authority to unite the fractured traitor forces. The Loyalist defenders, though exhausted and reduced to a fraction of their original strength, recognized the opportunity. They launched coordinated counterattacks across the palace complex, reclaiming positions that had been lost, driving back traitor forces that suddenly fought without coordination or purpose. The arrival of Robutai Guilliman's relief force on the 13th day after Horus's death sealed the traitor's fate. Caught between Terra's reinvigorated defenders and the fresh forces of Imperium Secundus, the traitor legions had no choice but to withdraw or face annihilation. The retreat became a rout. Those traitor forces that could reach their ships fled into the warp, abandoning weapons, equipment, and fallen brothers in their desperate rush to escape. Some traitor legions maintained discipline during the withdrawal, particularly the Iron Warriors, whose systematic retreat inflicted heavy casualties on pursuing loyalists. Others dissolved into mobs, every warrior fighting for his own survival. The traitor Primarchs disappeared into the warp, some seeking the Eye of Terror as a refuge, others following their own paths to damnation or redemption. But for the Imperium, victory felt hollow. The Emperor had been recovered from the Vengeful Spirit and brought to the Imperial Palace. But his condition was dire. Tech priests and apothecaries worked frantically to stabilize him. But it quickly became clear that his injuries exceeded even his legendary regenerative capabilities. The Master of Mankind was dying. And with his death, the Imperium he had built would likely collapse entirely. The Astronomicon would fail, plunging the entire galaxy into navigation chaos. The Imperial Webway portal would rupture, transforming Terra into a demon world. Everything would be lost. It was Malkador the Sigillitite who bought the time necessary to prevent total collapse. The Emperor's oldest friend and most trusted advisor, Malkador had served as regent during the Emperor's absence, holding Terra together through faith and willpower alone. Now, as the Emperor lay dying, Malkador made his final sacrifice. He took the Emperor's place upon the Golden Throne, using his own considerable psychic abilities to maintain the wards containing the Webway portal and power the Astronomicon while preparations were made to install the Emperor permanently.
Malkador's sacrifice was suicidal. The Golden Throne's psychic requirements exceeded even his enhanced capabilities, causing accelerated physical deterioration. Those who glimpsed the Sigillitite during his vigil described a figure withering before their eyes, aging centuries and hours. His robust frame shrank, his skin became translucent, his hair fell away. Yet his determination never wavered, and his kindness endured even through unimaginable suffering. He maintained his post for days, buying the precious time needed to modify the Golden Throne to accept the Emperor's broken body. When Rogel Dorn finally brought the Emperor to the throne chamber, Malkador summoned one final miracle. As attendants carefully removed him from the throne's framework, he reached toward his master with trembling hands. Contact between the two created what witnesses described as a bridge of golden light, an energy transfer through which Malkador imparted his remaining life force directly to the Emperor. In this final act of devotion, the Sigillitite's body crumbled to dust so fine it dispersed in the chamber's ventilation currents. The 7 minutes of consciousness Malkador's sacrifice purchased proved barely sufficient. The Emperor, speaking through damaged vocal cords in labored whispers, delivered essential instructions regarding the Golden Throne's operation and the Imperial's governance. He formally appointed Dorn as Praetorian with temporary authority to organize the High Lords of Terra. He emphasized that his interment should be presented not as death, but as strategic withdrawal, a temporary measure until his plans could reach fruition. Then, as life support systems activated and connection ports integrated with his nervous system, the Emperor's consciousness receded into whatever state he would occupy for the next 10,000 years.
The Emperor upon the Golden Throne is both alive and dead, conscious yet unable to communicate, present yet fundamentally isolated from the Imperium he sacrificed to build. His psychic power maintains the Astronomicon, the beacon that guides ships through the warp and makes interstellar travel possible. It holds closed the webway portal, preventing demonic invasion from below. It projects the Aegis that keeps Terra itself from being consumed by chaos. But the cost is unimaginable. Every day, approximately 1,000 Psykers are brought to the Golden Throne and sacrificed, their souls consumed to provide the energy necessary to sustain the Emperor's failing body. Perhaps the greatest tragedy lies in what came after. The Emperor had dedicated his existence to building a rational, secular imperium free from superstition and religious dogma. He had enforced the imperial truth, the doctrine that humanity could achieve greatness through reason and will rather than through faith in gods. He had specifically rejected any suggestion that he himself was divine, understanding that worship of individuals leads inevitably to stagnation and tyranny. The Imperium that emerged from his interment inverted every principle he had fought for. Within a single generation, the imperial cult transformed the emperor into a god. The ecclesiarchy emerged to enforce theological orthodoxy rather than rational inquiry. The Inquisition hunted heretics and mutants with religious fervor rather than reasoned judgment. Everything the emperor had attempted to prevent came to pass, and he, immobile upon the Golden Throne, was forced to witness his dream becoming nightmare. For Horus, there is no such torment. He is simply gone, erased so completely that his name became a curse throughout the Imperium. For 10,000 years, speaking his name has been forbidden, mentioning his achievements deemed heresy, acknowledging his existence considered treasonous.
The Imperium that might have celebrated him as its greatest hero instead pretends he never existed, writing him out of history as if will alone could undo the damage his rebellion caused. Yet Horus's legacy endures despite all attempts to erase it. The Space Marine legions were broken into smaller chapters following the heresy, divided specifically to prevent any single commander from wielding the power Horus had turned against the Imperium. The paranoia, suspicion, and brutal authoritarianism that characterizes the modern Imperium stems directly from betrayals that began with the Warmaster's fall. The endless warfare that defines the 41st millennium is, in many ways, merely a continuation of the civil war Horus initiated, brother still fighting brother across the galaxy's breadth. The Sons of Horus, renamed the Black Legion after their Primarch's death, continue waging the long war under Abaddon's command. They seek to complete what Horus began, to tear down the Imperium and replace it with something forged in Chaos's image. Every Black Crusade that spills from the Eye of Terror represents Horus's rebellion continuing, his dream of reshaping humanity enduring in twisted form long after the dreamer himself was unmade. Other traitor legions pursue their own agendas, each shaped by their Primarch's particular madness. The World Eaters seek endless slaughter in Khorne's name. The Death Guard spread Nurgle's plagues. The Emperor's children chase ever more extreme sensations in service to Slaanesh. The Thousand Sons manipulate reality according to Tuchan's incomprehensible schemes. All of them, in their various ways, continue the heresy that Horus unleashed, ensuring that the galaxy never knows peace. The Primarchs themselves have passed into legend. Horus is destroyed beyond recovery. Sanguinius died upon the Vengeful Spirit. Pharasmanes fell at Isstvan V. Some Primarchs disappeared into the warp, transformed into demon princes or pursuing mysterious purposes. Others vanished under unclear circumstances, their fates unknown even now. A few remained loyal to the Imperium, but eventually they too disappeared, leaving their chapters to carry on without their Genefather's guidance. Guilliman alone among the loyal Primarchs has returned to the Imperium in its darkest hour, awakening from stasis in the 41st millennium to find everything his father built transformed into a grotesque parody of the original vision. He fights now to reform the Imperium, to restore some measure of the rationality and purpose the Emperor intended. But he is one Primarch against 10,000 years of institutional decay, one voice of reason in a galaxy gone mad. The story of Horus Lupercal is ultimately a tragedy in the classical sense. It is the tale of a genuinely great man whose flaws were exploited by forces he couldn't comprehend until it was far too late to turn back. He was brilliant, charismatic, capable, worthy in every measurable way of the trust his father placed in him. Yet these very qualities, divorced from the wisdom and perspective that might have guided them properly, became the mechanisms of his downfall. His pride made him vulnerable to manipulation. His insecurity drove him to prove his worth. His love for his father transformed into hatred when he felt that love unreturned. His desire to protect humanity from what he perceived as the Emperor's failings led him to become humanity's greatest threat.
Could it have been prevented? Perhaps. If the Emperor had been more open with his sons about his plans and purposes, if he had explained the Webway project instead of withdrawing mysteriously to Terra, if he had recognized that his Primarchs were individuals with emotional needs rather than simply weapons to be deployed,
If Erebus had never reached Davin, if the lodges had never spread through the legions, if the Interrex had not been destroyed and the Onathame never stolen, if Horus had refused to enter the gate on Molech, if he had recognized earlier what he was becoming, if he had possessed the courage to reject chaos even after being corrupted. But history does not deal in hypotheticals. What happened, happened. Horus fell. The Imperium nearly died. The Emperor was entombed. And 10,000 years later, the galaxy still burns with the fires Horus ignited. The Horus Heresy is not merely an historical event, but the foundational trauma upon which the entire modern Imperium was built. Every policy, every institution, every article of faith traces its origins back to those 7 terrible years when brother fought brother and the dream of enlightened empire died in blood and fire. To understand the Imperium of the 41st millennium, you must understand Horus Lupercal. You must understand how the greatest hero can become the greatest villain, how trust can be weaponized, how corruption works patiently across years to achieve what force could never accomplish. You must understand that the Emperor's Imperium and the current Imperium are fundamentally different entities, separated by a gulf that can be measured in a single name: Horus. And perhaps most importantly, you must understand that the heresy never truly ended. It continues in every battle between loyalist and traitor, in every world that falls to chaos, in every moment when the Imperium's defenders must choose between pragmatic evil and principled defeat. The war Horus began 10,000 years ago rages still, and it will continue until either the Imperium finally collapses under the weight of its accumulated contradictions, or humanity finds some way to transcend the nightmare that the Warmaster's betrayal created. The Emperor sits upon the golden throne, neither living nor dead, watching over an Imperium that has become everything he fought against. Horus is gone, erased from existence, his name forbidden, his achievements denied. Between these two figures, father and first found son, lies the tragedy of the Horus Heresy, a war that nobody truly won, that cost everything and gained nothing, that transformed heroes into monsters and dreams into ashes. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And that war, more than any other, is Horus Lupercal's legacy to the species he claimed to love. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the complete story of Horus Lupercal, the Warmaster whose betrayal shaped the galaxy for 10 millennia, please consider liking this video and subscribe to the channel. There are countless other stories waiting to be told from the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Tales of heroes and villains, of sacrifice and betrayal, of the thin line between salvation and damnation. Until next time, remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, even the mightiest can fall, and the price of that fall is paid by generations yet unborn.